Well, welcome everybody to yet another PilotEdge workshop. We're continuing in our IFR series. We've been digging down very deeply into approaches. In fact, I think of all the subjects we've covered in the past, we have not spent quite so many back-to-back workshops on a single topic or a single subject area. But this is now, I believe, our fourth on approaches. So that's kind of where the rubber hits the road with instrument flying. It's a lot of where the meat is. So it really doesn't surprise me that we've spent quite this long, but we're nearly there, I think. And tonight, I'm really looking forward to, quite honestly. We've gone through the details of approaches again for the last three workshops, and tonight will be a little bit different. We'll be moving along a little bit of a faster pace, not going into quite so much detail. I doubt there'll be a terrific amount of new material. The goal here of this workshop is really to get people to the point where they could look at an instrument approach plate that they have not seen before, and their eyes will naturally be drawn to the highlights. The goal of this workshop is not to go into grim detail on every single piece of detail on every single plate that people submit for consideration. It really is to do a fairly rapid briefing, drag our mouse or draw the path that we would use to fly this, including the course reversal, and build some confidence in how we would approach an instrument approach for the first time. That way, if you're flying in the system or in real life, this will help. By the system, I mean the PilotEdge system. So if you're flying online or you're working on your instrument training, this really can boost your confidence when you're tackling approaches for the first time. One quick aside, I have noticed, at least where I fly, many pilots become very, very comfortable with a relatively small number of approaches, and not surprisingly, these are the approaches that they fly when they're doing their instrument currency, their legal instrument currency. So they're going to shoot their 6 approaches every 6 months, and they're going to do course tracking, and they're going to do holding. And I think it's unfortunate, but a lot of people actually just do the same 6 approaches every month. They go up on a nice day, and they bring up a friend of theirs, and they go get lunch at the same airport, and they shoot the same approaches going into the airport, then they shoot another one on the way out, and then they shoot some back at the home airport, and now they're instrument current. These would be the same pilots who are absolutely terrified to shoot anything other than those approaches, which really defeats the purpose. So you really don't want to memorize approaches. You just want to get really good at seeing an approach plate for the first time and being just as comfortable flying that as your approach to your home airport or something close to it. I have to admit myself that there is a certain warm and fuzzy feeling when I return to my home airport in bad weather, knowing that I know that approach inside and out, and I know the altitudes before I even look at them. That's an even bigger level of confidence. So I'm not going to say that you don't start memorizing certain approaches. That's not a terrible thing. But I will say it's still a very, very good idea to become quite comfortable briefing foreign approaches. Case in point, I just arrived here in Kentucky yesterday, and I shot an approach I'd never shot before, and it was an IMC, and I had a blast. And again, it was a plate that I'd never seen before until about 15 minutes before I actually shot the approach. And it was really no different than any other approach I'd shot before. So without further ado, we'll get started on the presentation and dive into this stuff. Now, there will come a time very shortly where I'm going to be asking people to type in a text message here in the room with a suggestion of an approach that they would like to have us review. I have a couple in the back of my mind, but I'd really rather that other people submit them, and don't feel any pressure or constraint that this has to be within the PilotEdge service area. Absolutely not. Any approach anywhere in the country, feel free to bring up. If we can pull up a plate for it, then it's worth taking a look at. So if we can, the goal will be to get through it, and as a refresher, we may go slightly slower on the first 1 or 2, or if it's a type of approach we haven't seen before in the previous workshops, I might go just a little bit slower, but otherwise, once we're at the at the middle of it and towards the tail end, we'll be moving at a relatively lightning pace. And also, if there are other people who would like to kind of take over and try analyzing the approach, I'm also happy for someone else to give it a try too, if that would be useful. All right, let's, Moon said, I'm in Kentucky. Let's look at what you did. And Mark, yes, I probably will cover, let's see how we're doing tonight. If there's plenty of time left over, I think I will see if I can cover visual approaches and contact approaches. Otherwise, we'll cover that in a sort of miscellaneous workshop. Awesome. And if anyone does post the URL to a plate, such as Mike did, thanks for doing that. If you could also include the title of the plate, either in a message before or after or as part of the link, just so I know what kind of approach it is. I may pick and choose based on the type of approach in terms of the sequence in which we look at them. Okie dokie. Okay, very quickly, here's what we've covered so far in the past. And there's a reason I've been using this in every IFR workshop. I really am trying to keep it structured and remind people to think about these things in terms of the phase of flight. Again, that helped me very much during my instrument training to work on various skill sets or subject areas broken up by phase of flight. It just helps categorize things, put them in buckets. So we have, as we've tackled IFR, we started out with a departure section. So we talked about SIDs and ODPs and diverse departures, VFR departures, so different ways of getting into the system. Then we covered the en route phase, the arrival phase, which would be stars. I think we focused almost exclusively on stars there, yep. And the last three, as I said, were focused on approaches, and we broke them down into precision versus non-precision approaches. As a very quick reminder, precision approach gives you vertical guidance through during the final approach segment, whereas a non-precision approach does not typically have any vertical guidance. Okay, and we also, once we started analyzing approaches, we broke them down into their segments, and I will admit this is an area that I didn't really grasp too well as I was initially learning IFR, and then once I finally broke down the approaches into these segments and understood their job, it became just a little bit easier to understand how to analyze an approach that I wasn't seeing for the first time versus one that I'd memorized. So there seemed to be these little rules and nuances that almost seemed to be memory work until I had categorized them into, okay, this is what's happening during this segment of the approach versus a later segment of the approach. So as a very quick reminder, we've got our 5 segments. Not every approach has all of these, but of the 5 that exist, we have feeder approaches. These get you from the highway to the driveway. I'm so happy with that term. I'm trying to use it more often. So the highways being the en route structure that we talked about in the second IFR workshop. So the feeder gets you off the highway and heading towards the driveway, which is ultimately where we're trying to get to, is the house in that metaphor. The initial segment turns you around, and you don't really burn at any point. Probably a bad choice of word there, but it rhymed, so it's that much cooler. Then we have the intermediate approach segment, which I was frightened to learn has about half the obstacle clearance that you're afforded during the feeder and initial segments. So we're down to just 500 feet of terrain and obstacle separation that's guaranteed during the approach segment. So try not to mess up during the intermediate segment. And then on to the final segment, and finally the missed approach segment. And again, you can, as a reminder, you can fly any approach either as a full approach from an initial approach fix or a feeder, potentially, or you may be vectored to the final segment or the final approach course. And in a radar environment, you're going to get vectors to the final more often. In non-radar environments or under certain circumstances, you should be prepared to fly the full approach. All instrument pilots need to be equally comfortable with doing both of these. It is not good enough to just be a rock star at one and just assume you'll never have to do the other. Not being able to do both of these can be a real problem. So make sure you're equally comfortable with both. And to that end, we will be talking about how to handle each of the approaches that are brought up. We're going to look at how to fly the full approach from each of the initial approach initial approach fixes or feeder routes, as well as we'll also talk about what we would expect when receiving vectors to final on that approach, if applicable. We have our approach categories as a reminder. So these affect the minimums, the visibility that's required, and the altitude to which you might be able to descend. You will be flying the approach as either Category A through E aircraft, and these are the speeds associated with both. So that, again, once we start looking at plates, that's what that is all about. I will probably only mention the minimums once or twice, and then we will not really worry about the categories so much. So let's just assume for this evening, I think the most generally applicable one would be category either A or B. So we'll alternate between those as we're talking about the approaches. All right, here we go. So approach analysis. We're going to pull up some plates, work out how we'd fly the full approach from all available initial approach fixes and feeders, as well as vectors to final. Nothing new there. It's what I just said 30 seconds ago. In addition, we're going to talk about how we'd set the nav equipment for each approach until we find that there's almost no variety. Perhaps we might skip that part. The most important thing that we'll be looking at is the ground track. I want to be able to use a mouse and draw the track over the ground. If you cannot do that for an approach, you cannot fly it. It's that simple. I think it was Rod Machado who mentioned that as a skill that you really want to have when you're briefing an approach. If you can't draw your finger over the plate and say this is where the plane needs to go, then you really haven't got a hope of flying it. So that's the first challenge, is understanding what the track over the ground needs to be and what the altitudes are at each point. Then the second part of flying the approach is, okay, how do I make this airplane with this navigation equipment and these tools with automation? How do I make the plane do those things? And those are two actually fairly separate skills. So we'll be talking about the ground track first and foremost, and then to some extent we'll talk about how to set up the nav equipment on each approach as well. And as a final reminder before we dig in, I promise we are going to get started, I would highly encourage everybody here, if you have any interest in instrument flying, either it's just a passing interest or you're doing a lot of online flying or you're doing real-world flying, I cannot tell you how beneficial this exercise was. I think I mentioned it a while ago, but it bears repeating. I must have looked at 100 to 150 approach plates, not back-to-back, admittedly. I would have gone nuts, but over the course of time during my training, I think I must have just looked at 100 to 150 that I never flew, by the way, just totally random, just to get that first skill set right, the skill set of dragging my finger over it and saying, okay, this is where I am, this is the segment that I'm on, this is what we're going to be doing next, this is how we set up the equipment, these are the altitudes we're going to be at, without ever having actually flown it. If you can become a rock star at that, then the only thing that remains is to make the plane do it, which is I think one of the reasons people get so overwhelmed during instrument training is they're trying to learn both of these things potentially at the same time in the airplane, and that's very bad. You can't be trying to work out where the plane should be as well as struggling with how to make the plane do those things. So I think if you break up into those two skill sets, keep them separate, your life becomes that much bearable as an instrument student. Okay. Any questions, any general questions before we begin? I want to give people an opportunity to ask in case there were any. All right, let me have a look right here. Okay, so we've got some approach plates posted, very good. And Mark, I'm glad that feeder routes were awesome for you. I can tell you that's probably one of the most misunderstood segments. I actually was talking to a guy who just received his instrument rating a few days before I had dinner with him, and he pulled out an approach plate to ask a question that he was asked when he was being checked out at a new flight school, and he had to do a quiz, and the questions were so poorly written, he was confused by them. It actually showed that the person who wrote the questions didn't quite understand how the approach plate worked themselves. But also this poor fellow who just got his ticket actually had no idea what a feeder route was as well. So yes, feeder routes not very well understood, and they are very very helpful. Do approaches ever change enough that doing an approach from memory can ever be dangerous? I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think I have seen. Oh, I do have a good answer to that. I have a great answer to that. I was racking my brain to think if I could think of one approach plate that has changed radically, and there is one. It's the ILS 19 right. It changed so radically I had to rewrite the entire I6 rating around it. There was a time when the feeder approach from Seal Beach didn't go to Sega, And Sega was the ILS 19 riders has been the focus of the last 3 workshops, either the ILS or the localizer version. So yes, they do change. Now, truth be told, you won't be flying the full approach from Seal Beach in the real world very often. But had you done that from memory, yes, you'd be violated and it would be terrible. However, don't worry, because that would never happen. You would never actually fly an approach completely from memory without the plate. So I hope I didn't misspeak before. I didn't mean to give the impression that when I am flying my approach at home, I always still, and I'm not saying that just because there might be students here, and I don't want to give them the wrong impression. I can honestly say I always, 100% of the time, pull out the approach plate and brief it. It's just that I'm kind of going through the motions. I already know most of what's there, but I am looking for, I am moving my mouse over it. I'm sorry, not my mouse. I am moving my finger over the plate as I'm briefing those items. So if something significant had changed, you would still find out. But to your point, you have the right idea. Flying it exclusively from memory would be a fairly serious mistake. The only time I could think that might work would be if you had briefed the approach, if you'd verified that it is still the same old approach and you truly have got it committed to memory, then I suppose it could be argued that you could fly it relatively safely without having looked at the plate as you're flying it. But that's about as far as I would go with that. Now, you definitely have to review the plate at some point. Okie dokie. Well, thank you everyone for posting some plates. Let's see what we got. I'm going to do them in order. And so Moon said, oh, you know what, Moon? I take it back. Because that's one that I did, I'd really rather post one that someone specifically did. So Moon, I'll tell you what, let's do that one either in the middle or last. If for some reason I forget, definitely hold me to that task and remind me, hey, what was the approach in Kentucky? But for now, since I didn't actually post that one myself, I'd like to do one that someone specifically posted. So first cab off the rank is my friend Mike, and he has not told me what approach plate that is, but we'll just open it and find it. Drum roll. This is very exciting. The Medford Rogue Valley International in Medford, the VOR Alpha. Well, I think we just hit our new subject material. I don't think we actually ever covered approaches that are not aligned with a runway. Or I should say more accurately, circling approaches. Okay, so this will be one where we go into just a little bit more detail. Now, we had covered circling as an option. We talked about circling, but that was on an approach, I think it may have been, for example, the Burbank ILS runway 8. You could shoot an ILS approach heading towards towards one runway, i.e. the runway associated with the approach, like runway 8 at Burbank. And then you could circle to runway 15 if it was blowing like crazy out of the southeast and you didn't want to handle that excessive crosswind component. So we've talked about circling in general, at least briefly, but I think this is the first time we're dealing with an approach that is not, that won't have any straight-in minimums associated with it. Okay, let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, so indeed, the first thing that's radically different is on the minimums. You see they only have circling minimums. Even though there is a runway 14 and a runway 32, there's no references to those runways here. This is purely a circling approach. So very quickly, circling approaches can be established under one of two circumstances. Either the final approach course is not aligned or closely enough aligned with the runway. Don't quote me on the figure. Somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees. I think if it exceeds I believe it's more like 30. So let's go with 30 for now. If it exceeds a 30-degree angle between the final approach course and the runway, then straight-in minimums will not exist for that approach. At a glance, that's not what's going on here. See, notice there is a runway 14 here. This airport diagram is very, very handy for that. So we have runway 14 right there, and we can see the final approach course, which is where my mouse is. It's a 146 heading. So there's only a 6-degree difference between the final approach course and the runway. So why on earth don't they publish straight-in minimums for it? The reason they don't is because there's an excessive descent gradient. So if the descent gradient from the final approach fix down to the minimum descent altitude exceeds a certain value, then I'm sorry, down to the it's down to the height of the airport. My mistake, not the minimums. Essentially, if it's too steep of an approach, then they will not publish straight-in minimums. So it is expected that even though you're coming in relatively straight into this, you're heading pretty much towards the runway, there's a good chance that you may end up having to circle for that runway, i.e. doing basically a turn over the top of the airport, keeping the runway in sight. Okay, so that's the first thing that's different. We may be circling, and Santa Monica is a good example of this as well. There's a VOR alpha at Santa Monica, which is also perfectly aligned with runway 21, and yet straight-in minimums don't exist. I'm not sure how many people have flown the VOR alpha, but I've never had to actually circle for it. Depending on the type of airplane you're in, it's really your judgment call. If you arrive at the minimum descent altitude and you can spot the field from far away enough and you can land without any abnormal maneuvering, you can make a normal landing, then you're still welcome to make a straight-in approach. You don't legally have to circle. It's just that there is an expectation you might need to circle. And the minimums will reflect that. They'll be a good deal higher. Okay, I apologize. I am traveling at the moment. I am in Kentucky, as I said, so I'm going to have a bit of a hard time juggling between the approach plates and the text, but I will do my best.
My specific question would be how to enter this directly from the north, because you have to fly out in India. That was my problem there.
Okay, all right, we're going to go through it right now. Just as soon as I find that window. Okay, so this, let's have a look. All right, so the goal here will be to trace the path that we would fly on this approach. Okay, and I can annotate from here. So this approach is relatively simple. Compared to some of the plates we've looked at in the past with multiple feeders or multiple initial approach fixes, we don't have a whole lot going on here. This approach begins at a single initial approach fix, which is Rogue Valley VOR, and there is a course reversal that is executed north of the VOR. So Mike, I can see your confusion, which is what do you do if you're arriving from the north? So let's deal with the case where we're being cleared for the full approach, and let's take a slightly simpler case just for now, just to illustrate the mechanics of the course reversal, and then we'll tackle your particular case, which is arriving from the north, which is a bit more advanced. So let's assume we were out here at the southwest, and we were cleared for this approach. I'm not going to worry too much about altitudes right this second, simply because I don't have all the information in front of me. Scrolling is a bit tricky. Just give me one sec. Yeah, sure enough, I can't easily scroll right now in annotate mode. So if we arrive from the southwest, we'd head towards the Rogue Valley VOR. We'd join the course outbound for a minute and execute the course reversal. The actual specific mechanics of how you execute this course reversal are optional. This would be the most, I don't want to say standard, but this is the one which is taught at least most frequently that I can tell. And it basically matches the barb that they have drawn here. I'll tell you what, let me zoom in on this because it is probably going to be a little bit hard for people to see. Hopefully that's better. Okay, so arriving from the southwest, join the final approach course outbound, execute the course reversal. The goal of the course reversal here is to remain east. They want you to reverse your course, i.e. go from heading north to ultimately heading south. They want all of that maneuvering, whatever it is you do, if it involves a loop or an Immelman or a split S or any series of turns, all of that needs to occur on the east side of the final approach course. That's what the barb over here, the 45-degree barb, is telling you. Do you have to reverse course the exact way I've drawn here? Hopefully not, because I've drawn it really badly. But aside from that, no, you don't. You do not have to do it this specific way. But if you do elect to do it, they've given you some help. They've shown you what the heading would be on the outbound, which is 027. And then when you execute the 180-degree left turn to come back in, it's a 207 course inbound. So that's the 45-180 technique, where you make a 45-degree turn, go outbound for a minute, make a 180. Make sure you do the 180 heading away from the from where you came from. You don't want to execute it like this, where you turn right, because by the time you intercept, you may intercept way too close to what is ultimately going to become the final approach fix. So you want to give yourself plenty of room, and that's how that would normally be done. Mike, is there any surprise for you so far on what I've described? I know you had a slightly different question, which is what do you do if you're coming from the north? But does any of that part surprise you so far?
Yeah, this is all good. I tell you, I'm sorry to be on the voice. It's a lot quicker. The descent sequence, which is the horizontal, is really always a problem for me. How far do I fly before I make my standard return turn? Where do I start descending to 6,400 from 7 that is coming in? And how do I use the circle of altitudes below this 25 circle around Rogue Valley for descent, for my pattern of descent? This is actually the biggest problem I have in this type of approaches.
Okay, gotcha. So you're saying the lateral version of this, you followed the general turns, but you weren't sure when. You wanted some more specifics, which is when to commence the turns, how far to fly. That's the part which is confusing for you right now.
And the sharp turn from the north, which is the other problem that I have with it. Sorry.
Yep. Okay. Very good. So excellent question. And the procedure turn, that you'll notice there's no distances here. In the past, we've dealt with very specific segments that had minimum en route altitudes and distances. And I keep harping on that. The difference between a flyable segment and a non-flyable segment is flyable segments will have these pieces of information on them. And you'll notice they're very vague about that here. In fact, none of that stuff is there on this course reversal. So that's a very good question, which is, okay, do I really have to go from Rogue Valley to this particular piece of terrain? And if so, how far is that? So it is purely coincidental. This is basic symbology for a course reversal. It does not accurately reflect your track over the ground. So you'll notice when I drew it before, I didn't start the right turn in the drawing at the same place they did the barb. I deliberately kept it sort of different. So it could be here, and the whole thing might have happened before the barb, if you like. So there isn't a hard and fast rule in terms of when a time or a distance from the VOR. It could be 30 seconds, it could be 1 minute. Usual practice that I've been taught and have seen other people use is about a minute outbound prior to starting the course reversal. However, there is one hard constraint here, which is not drawn on the bird's eye view here that we're looking at. To get this critical piece of information, you've got to go down to the vertical profile. And that's here. See the remain within 10 miles? The course reversal has got to occur entirely within a 10 nautical mile radius of the VOR. That is the only way in which you're guaranteed the terrain and obstacle separation. So if you're flying an SR-71 and you come blasting in at Mach 3 and you take 30 miles to do this course reversal, then there is absolutely no guarantee that doing it that coming down to 6,300 feet will be a survivable event. It's only a survivable event to go down to 6,300 if you remain within 10 nautical miles. So that is the absolute hard answer, Mike, to your question, which is where does this all have to occur? The answer is it has to occur within 10 nautical miles. Can you do it within 3 miles? Yes. Can you do it within 6? Yes. Can you do it within 9? Yes. As long as you keep it within 10, you will, I promise you, you will not hit anything, provided you do it on the east side of the final approach course. If you elect to go out here, sorry, the swapping between annotation modes is a little bit slow. If you elect to reverse course out here, then you do actually get some terrain and obstacle separation down to the published number of 6,300 feet, I believe, but it's only just a tiny bit west. So if you're on the wrong side, my understanding is you lose your terrain and obstacle separation pretty quickly. The reason they have to give you some is that imagine if there was a giant volcano right over here, like literally 300 feet west of the outbound course. I mean, it's kind of cruel that someone would have to fly so precisely that they don't even venture 300 feet west of that. A strong crosswind could blow you over there if you're not careful. So there is terrain and obstacle separation given to you on the wrong side, if you like, but it doesn't extend very far over on the wrong side. So you can't go very far west before your terrain and obstacle separation disappears. That's at least my understanding. And even if my understanding is wrong, even if the terrain and obstacle separation is just as good on the west side as it is the east side, you're still legally compelled to execute the course reversal on the right side. So either way you want to approach it, you've got to do the course reversal on the right side. So Mike, before we cover the case from the north, does that cover your question about the specifics of where the course reversal happens?
Where do I stay at 6,300 and start my reversal at this altitude, or I use a minute and then keep on descending to 6,300, and then when I'm inbound I start descending to 4,000 or whatever that is. That's my another kind of goofy thing. I don't know when to do those altitudes.
Okay, excellent. This is a new area for us because the course reversal altitude, we have a separate course reversal altitude here of 6,300 feet compared to the altitude that you can descend to once you're established inbound, whereas the ILS at John Wayne, these two numbers were the same, so this is a slightly different notation. So Mike, the question you're asking yourself is absolutely critical. It's just as important as okay, where do I fly the plane laterally? Now we're dealing with the vertical part, because there should be zero, and I mean literally zero ambiguity as to when you can leave one altitude for another. That skill is just as important as the first part. So I'm really, really glad that you asked it. It's worth becoming a rock star and knowing those numbers too. So let's deal with the vertical profile of this approach. And let's assume that we were out here to the southwest and we were flying at 7,000 feet, and the controller said, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, cleared direct Rogue Valley, crossed Rogue Valley at 7,000, cleared VOR Alpha approach. So remember, they need to give us that. We covered the elements of an approach clearance. Because we're not on a segment of the approach when we are down here, they have got to give us an altitude to maintain until we are established on the segment of the approach. So first question is, what altitude do we fly between our present position and Rogue Valley? The answer is simple. It's 7,000. That was in the clearance. Again, that clearance was cross Rogue Valley at 7,000, cleared VOR Alpha approach. So we're at 7K on segment 1. I don't know how to do text, so I'm going to try and draw the number 1. That's 7,000. Now the next question is, as we are maneuvering for our course reversal here, when can we descend? You know the answer is going to be 6,300. Just looking at the bottom of that plate. While we're maneuvering for the course reversal, it's 63. You can descend down to 6,300. You might wonder, okay, can I only descend down to 6,300 once I start the 45-degree right turn or something like that? And the answer is no. You don't have to wait till the 45-degree right turn. Again, how you execute this reversal is actually up to you. You do not have to do a 45-degree right turn. You could do a right 90-degree turn if you like. You can do anything you want. So there's no regulation that says you can only start once you've begun the 45 outbound or something like that. So 7,000 to Rogue Valley, then we can descend to 6,300 while we are executing our course reversal. And the next big question is, when can we leave 6,300? And the answer is, once we are established on the final approach course inbound, we can then descend to 4,600. And so the entire course reversal is flown at, sorry about all the scrolling, that's going to make the annotation useless. Really quick question, Mike, when I'm just using the little black mouse here, can you see that?
It's a lot better than you're wasting time with these annotations. It's perfect.
Oh, good, thank you. I wasn't sure if the mouse was really visible or not. Excellent then. So 7,000 Rogue Valley, 6,300 during the course reversal. We're still at 63, still at 63, still at 63. Boom. Once you're established on the 342 radial inbound, which essentially means you're on the 162 heading, then you can drop down to the next altitude, which is, I believe we said 4,300. Sorry, 4,600. So there's 3 key altitudes until we reach the final approach fix. The altitude the controller gave us to maintain, which is 7, it would be a huge mistake to simply drop to 6,300 immediately upon receiving the clearance, because again, that first part of the clearance was cross Rogue Valley at 7,000. That's not on the plate. So that's something you've got to be really listening for. The approach doesn't begin until you hit Rogue Valley. So it's a good way to think of it as I'm still basically on the en route phase, and the controller is going to help me out because I'm on a random route right now. I'm in the middle of nowhere. So the controller is legally on the hook for my terrain and obstacle separation. So it'll be cross Rogue Valley at 7. So we're going to go 7. Then we're going to go to 6,300 anytime you like during the course reversal. As soon as you hit the final approach course inbound, we're down to 43. And then once we cross Rogue Valley, we can then make the left turn to 146. We're now on the final approach segment, and we can drop down to the minimum descent altitude, which, let's say we're doing at Category A, is going to be 2,680 feet. We need 1.25 miles visibility, and here's the big number that should get our attention, 1345. Remember, the number in parentheses is for non-civilian use, i.e. military use. You can ignore it. That 1345 is very, very telling. It tells us that this is a terrible approach that's almost useless. It literally has to be VFR at this airport to be able to get in on this approach. So it's going to leave us mighty high. The minimum descent altitude is 1,345 feet above the ground. That's above pattern altitude at most airports. And the, let's see, our final approach fix, sorry, the missed approach waypoint here is basically right over the beginning of the runway. So yeah, not particularly useful, except maybe for descending through a layer of clouds that's above the airport, but it's not going to get you in, with 200 or 300 overcast or anything like that. So Mike, are you good so far on the altitudes that we covered?
Yes, the north approach, and just so you know, this all is surrounded by mountains. So the idea is, yeah, it will let you drop through some layers, and it's non-precision. So obviously, it can be that way. The circle of altitudes on the around the VOR, it's 7,000, 10,700, a little lower there. That tells you that. How do you use that? It's 23 nautical miles from the Rogue Valley. How do you use it in your approach and descent?
You don't.
From the north and from the right.
You don't use the minimum safe altitude there. That is for emergency use only. So if you were to lose communications while you were being vectored for the approach, for example, or while you're being vectored in the area, and you needed to quickly know what altitude will not kill you, that's what the MSA is for, and that's about it. It's not to be used as a reference while you're shooting the approach to help provide any kind of vertical guidance during the maneuvering under normal conditions. So it's not even something you really need to look at for when you're just doing a normal briefing of the approach. That's my opinion of it, at least.
It's perfect. I'll tell you why, because often I have a lot lower need to approach comparing to my Victor route. Victor would be 10,000, close to it, all the way to Rogue Valley, but I have to drop to 7. And I thought maybe that is part of the suggestion that if you're coming to that airport, and then you could expect that controller will give you earlier descent than 10,000, even though Victor route is 10,000, but I guess not.
Yeah, it doesn't really set much expectation for you because if you look at the area that this thing is covering, it's a 25 nautical mile radius, which probably exceeds the what's depicted on the plate, and it's through pretty big swaths of radial. So anything from this this is what, the 280 radial out to the what is that, out to the northeast there. This is just such a massive area, or a massive quadrant, if you like. It's like you're taking the entire compass and just splitting it into 4 quadrants in a mountainous area. That's why these altitudes are so ridiculously high compared to the altitudes associated with segments of the approach. So this is really just okay, well, I'm stuck here on the east, I've lost communications, I was being vectored. What altitude should I climb to right this second that's as quickly as I can, that's going to keep me safe of terrain in this area? And that's about all that's really all about it's for.
It's perfectly answered my questions about this descent pattern. Just now, it's a goofy approach. I did come in all the way from the north on radio, whatever, 333. How do I make that left turn? What is the technique actually to do it right, to make that huge left turn?
Honestly, it's a pretty awkward approach to fly the full approach when you're coming from the north. This would be one of those cases where a vector from the controller would be helpful. Because the job of this course reversal is twofold. And again, this is the turn and burn, right? This is the course reversal associated with the initial approach segment. Its job is to get you aligned with the final approach course and to descend you safely. Well, if you're arriving from the north, it's kind of awkward because you're already aligned with the course, so that makes it a bit of a pain. And if the controller gets you low enough, then he's pretty much, or she is setting you up for the approach without you having to execute the course reversal, as long as they tell you that it's a vector to final. So that would be the preferred way of doing it from the north. Now, there are very specific requirements for a controller to be able to vector you like that for an approach, and they may not be met at a mountainous airport like this in a relatively isolated area. In fact, let me check the facility that you'd be talking to here. Well, at least it is a Tracon, so that's a start. If it was a center control, you'd have almost no hope of getting a vector to final. But it says here that this is with Cascade approach, so they may have a hope of vectoring you to final. But if not, let's assume that you were arriving from somewhere in the north, then I haven't really had to look at these very often, but my understanding is you'd have to basically execute the reversal almost twice. You'd have to head yourself back north and then fly it as though you just arrived from the north. And the goal would be to execute all of that again on the east side. So you'd probably make a left more than a 180, join the course outbound. At that point, I doubt I'd wait for a minute, but then I'd execute the course reversal like that. So it almost ends up looking like a bow tie or a figure eight. I just want to double check with there's someone here who has a better understanding of some of the hardcore regulations than I, which would be Peter. Peter, would you mind chiming in on this one if you're available? Am I right that if you were doing it from the north, you would basically have to you'd have to maneuver and join the final approach course outbound, then execute a standard course reversal at that point?
Yeah, small information. All the Victor routes are 7,000 or higher on the north side. So there's no really way to get descent lower than that, to go straight in. You have to make it back and forth.
Yep, yeah, in that case, yeah, you would have to make the turn at a Rogue Valley and basically do a double procedure turn. The only thing I might do personally is I'd actually go to the right, and I know it's counterintuitive, but it's just a personal knowledge thing. Because the hold is to the right of the VOR, the hold is going to give you more terrain clearance to the right next to the VOR than to the left. But honestly, either way is a safe option in that case. But me personally, I'd actually go to the right, which is counterintuitive. It also sets you up better, so you in essence could do a figure eight for your procedure turn, but that's more advanced. But yeah, you would have to in essence turn around at Rogue Valley.
Peter, are you saying, when you say left or right, do you mean you would do the hold west of Rogue Valley, or you would you'd sort of do this direct entry but make a left turn, i.e. holding east of Rogue Valley?
You could do it either way. Me personally, I'd go to the west towards the actual missed approach hold.
If there was not a missed approach hold published there, what would you do? Let's say there was a holding fix that was somewhere else. How would you handle Rogue Valley? If you, how would you fly the approach from the north if there wasn't a holding pattern depicted there?
In that case, I'd go to the east. I'd do the, from the airplane perspective, left to the east, re-intercept. It once again depends on the plane, but assuming a light GA aircraft, you're going to have enough time to re-intercept the, what's that, the 342 outbound, do your minute timing. I do a little more than a minute in that case because you have the whole turn. If you hit the VOR and started your minute, you'd only be turned around by the time it expired. So maybe 2 minutes, and then just do whatever type of procedure turn style you like to do.
Gotcha. So generally speaking, you're trying to get yourself established outbound. You're trying to almost cover up the fact that you came from the north and make it look as though you came from the south, or it ultimately looks the same for this segment, right? Once you're trying to get yourself established outbound on this 342 radial, and then do the course reversal as we discussed at the beginning.
Yes, and the reason for that's assuming you're in a bare bones airplane where you don't have a moving map or anything like that, and you don't have the best idea about the wind. If I'm off to the west, I don't know how far to the west I am. If there was a wind, or I should say, excuse me, off to the east. If I'm off to the east, I don't know how far east I am. So if there's a strong crosswind, I can end up so far east without realizing it that by the time I turn back around in, sort of pretending to do it as a hold, that I won't intercept the 162 inbound, and now I really don't know where I am, and now I'm running out of time to fix it. So I always want to get that positive course guidance personally.
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to be careful that I don't end up blowing my entire allotment of time on one approach plate. I know people will throw sticks and stones if I end up doing that, but there was enough new material in this one between the circling approach, and we have the two different altitudes during the course reversal. Plus, Mike asked a great question, which is, what if you're arriving from the north? Is this really as awkward as it appears? And Mike, it is as awkward as it appears. As awkward as it is, though, the initial part of maneuvering is awkward, but once you've done the procedure turn, it becomes very, very standard. So you'll be established at those altitudes, 6,300, you join the final approach course, and life is good. As you pointed out, Mike, if you tried to just simply arrive at Rogue Valley and say, well, close enough, I'm heading south, I'm just going to go straight in from here, you've got this big problem, which is that you're stuck at 7,000 feet, whereas it was designed, in fact, I was about to say you should be at 6,300 at Rogue Valley. That's actually not the case at all. Remember, once you're heading back inbound on the approach, you're hitting Rogue Valley for the second time. By then you should be down to 4,300 feet, 4,600 feet. So if you simply arrived at Rogue Valley at 7 and tried to join the final approach course heading towards the airport, you've got a 2,400 foot disadvantage, or 2,400 feet higher, because you're starting it at 7K. So it may seem simpler to try and make a straight in, but that could be the first link in the accident chain where you're high, and now you're starting to dive aggressively. You pick up a lot of airspeed, and then you might end up botching the landing because you're coming in far too fast. So yeah, as awkward as it looks, do all that maneuvering north of the VOR and get yourself established inbound, and then once you're established inbound on the approach properly, you'll quickly forget where it is you came from. Whether you started this approach from the southwest, the southeast, the northeast, or northwest, or dead north, ultimately, it's all going to end up looking the same during the final course reversal, which is here. You're going to intercept at the right altitudes, and then the approach begins proper.
Keith, I have a quick question.
Go.
So, from a safety perspective, arriving from the north, I guess I don't understand. Let's assume you're at 7,000 feet arriving from the north. Why at 10 DME you can't, on the inbound 162 course, you can't begin your descent down to 4,600?
If you are on the 342 radial inbound?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you were established on the radial and you're saying you stayed at 7,000 until you were at the 10 DME, and at that point you just dropped yourself down all the way down to 4,600, right?
Right.
Within 10 DME. Yeah, I mean, that seems like it would be logical to me. Peter, do you know if you would be allowed to do that? If you're allowed to not execute the course reversal? Something tells me you can't, but I'm only because if a course reversal is published, it must be flown. That's the only regulation I can think of. But practically speaking, if you were established on the 342 radial inbound outside of 10 DME, and once you got to 10 DME, you dropped down through 6,300 all the way down to 4,600, would there be anything, practically it seems okay, but are we foul of any regulations by doing that?
Yeah, once again, while you're not going to hit anything, it's not a legal action to do. And that's simply because the regulations state that a procedure turn must be flown unless one of about 5 or 6 different criteria are met. Unfortunately,
Yep.
one of those criteria is not aligned with the final approach course, even though, or actually in this case, the intermediate approach course, because even though that would be logical in this case. A trick around this, if you can get the controller to sign off on it, which is going to depend a lot on the controller, is you could be cleared for the straight-in VOR alpha approach, which would waive the procedure turn and meet that regulatory requirement. The trick is that's unlikely to happen in this case because there is no Victor airway on the 342 radial out of Rogue Valley. And my hunch is looking at the altitudes, you would end up having being too high to pull that off. You know, the Oroka in that area is 12,000 feet. Looking at the approach, you're going to end up too high to make that safe descent. Admittedly, in a 172 or a small GA airplane, you can really get it down, but if you're in anything bigger, you're going to run into the time to descend problem.
Yeah, I had a feeling that from a practical standpoint it would be okay, but there was this niggling thing of the regulation getting in the way, and like you, I couldn't think of any exception to it, unless if you're right, if the controller did clear you for the straight in, but getting that is going to be non-trivial. So from a practical standpoint, you'd think you'd be able to do it. From a regulatory standpoint, you're actually supposed to do the bow tie reversal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to, just so we make sure that we cover enough approaches, I'm going to move on from this one. There are a couple of things I would have liked to go into detail on, but I'm very cognizant of the time, so I'm going to move on from this particular one, and then and we'll see what happens. But we'll talk more about the communications and the actual navigation equipment setup as promised on one of the on the rest of the approaches now. But Mike, that was a doozy to start off with. Thank you. Okay, Mercy has the CAPEC 3 RNAV. Ah, that was a nice trick, Mercy. The CAPEC 3 is actually not an instrument approach. That's a star into Las Vegas, and so we're focusing on. We actually did cover the CAPEC 3 during the third IFR workshop. So this is instrument approaches only. Nice test there. You thought I was going to fall for it. Oh my goodness, Peter submitted one. I'm actually frightened of what we're about to look at.
No, there's only one trick in this one.
Oh, it's a VOR alpha. Great. All right. Okay, I have not seen this approach. It's like a magic trick. I have not seen this plate before. I have met Peter once before in my life, but I did not know he was going to be sending me this approach. Oh. Wow, this is beautiful. Yeah, there is no final approach fix on this one. Is that the trick, Peter?
Now the trick's in the minimums.
Okay. I was actually hoping we'd find one that didn't have a published final approach fix, because that's a good discussion point. Ah, so we have two different circling minimums, and is it the letter C here? Is this one of those plates that has the new types of circling approach minimums?
Yep, yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up, the fact that approaches always change. This actually isn't even a current approach plate. It's not current until the second, but they finally got around to making that change.
Okay. All right. Okay, let's go through the basics of it, the stuff that I promised we'd go through. Then we'll talk about what's special with the circling approach minimums that are interesting. So not only does this, a quick preview, not only does this have two different set of circling minimums. One is if you can identify the Njort, am I pronouncing that right? Yep, the Njort intersection, and the other is if you can't. That is not necessarily new. We did see different minimums for a couple of approaches based on whether you could identify one of the step-down fixes inside the final approach fix. So that's not new. But you'll notice there is a bold C in front of the circling minimums. I had read about those. This is the first chart I've seen that has them, so that's actually pretty exciting. All right then. So at a glance, we see that we have a feeder. We have Westminster is a feeder. We know it's not an initial approach fix because it doesn't say IAF on top of it. And we have Martinsburg that is also a feeder. And the approach itself commences from the Frederick VOR, which happens to be co-located at an airport, at the airport. I don't see this very often. Like, I've read about them, I just haven't seen them very often. So that is a pretty interesting case. Okay, so we'll talk about what's going on again at a high level with the, we'll do the annotations, which may not be popular, but I'll try one and see if I can do it efficiently. So let's talk about the lateral track. So from Martinsburg, we're going to be heading eastbound. We're going to hit the VOR. We're going to go outbound. We're going to reverse course, join the final approach segment, and shoot the approach from there. That's one way of doing it. From Westminster, same deal. We'd probably end up spending some time getting reestablished on that course outbound. Fly for a minute, reverse course, same deal. Fantastic. That's from the two feeders. We could have also been randomly, we may have just been getting just a part of the SFRA, and we may just be cleared direct to Frederick. So across Frederick, at or above, I'll pick a random altitude, 4,000, cleared VOR alpha approach. So either way, we're starting this approach at Frederick if we're flying the full approach, and it's the same deal. So once you're at Frederick, this is going to be flown the same regardless of how you got to Frederick. So whether it's from Westminster, Martinsburg, or Frederick, it's going to be flown the same way. So that's all very similar. Let's talk about what's a little bit different in terms of segments. So when we're flying from Westminster to Frederick, we're on the feeder segment. Once we cross Frederick and start heading outbound, we're on the initial approach segment, so the course reversal. Remember, what normally happens is you execute the course reversal, you join the track inbound, and at some point you cross the final approach fix. And non-precision final approach fix is that Maltese cross. We went into that in grim detail when we were looking at the localizer 19 right at John Wayne. So let's go ahead and find our Maltese cross on the plate down here. Can anyone see one? If not, you need to stop drinking. So if you can, you need to stop drinking because there is no Maltese cross here. So this is a relatively rare case, at least to my understanding. I have not seen many of these. I read about them, but they're relatively rare. So in this case, the big question is when are we moving away from the initial approach segment, and when are we established on the final approach segment? And the answer is once you are established on the, once the procedure turn is complete, you're considered to be on the final approach segment. So think of the Maltese cross as being a sliding object in this case, and it occurs wherever you join that final approach course inbound. Now you're on the final approach segment. In terms of how we'd fly it from navigational equipment standpoint, that some of that depends a little bit on where you're flying it from. So if you're flying it from Westminster, you'd obviously have to involve the Westminster VOR. There's many different techniques for doing it. One would be to fly this. I'm going to assume you only have one nav radio, for example. You might fly this on the nav1, fly Westminster on the nav1. Once you get to Frederick, you swap over to using Frederick on the nav1 and keep Westminster on the nav2 from assuming you have two nav radios. The reason you want to keep Westminster, at some point you're going to need it to identify this Njort fix if you're going to use the VOR to identify Njort. If you have RNAV capability and you can dial that in, then great, you could use that to identify Njort instead. But if you don't have GPS capability, it's likely you're going to need to keep a reference to Westminster. It does get a bit more exciting flying it from Martinsburg, because now we're going to involve, at some point, 3 different VORs. We have Martinsburg, Frederick, and we still need to use Westminster to identify Njort. So in that case, a good way to do it might be to fly with Martinsburg on the nav2, with Frederick on the nav1. As you get to, once you hit Frederick and you're heading outbound on the approach, you would flip over from Martinsburg on the nav2 to Westminster on the nav2. So if you had managed to set all this up in advance, you'd have Martinsburg on nav2 primary, Westminster nav2 secondary, and Frederick on nav1 primary. That way, you really only have to hit one button to swap your nav2 from Martinsburg to Westminster, and that's about it. So that's how we'll be setting up the nav radios for that one. At least that's how I'd approach it. And then from Westminster, yes, we have to use that 267 radial to identify Njort. So let's see, we've talked about the lateral. Let's talk about our altitudes. Let's assume that we were told to cross Martinsburg at a particular altitude. Just for time, now these feeders are typically, feeders are there again to get you from the highway to the driveway. The highway would be the low en route structure, like Victor Airways. So I was tempted to say, let's assume that the controller tells you to cross Martinsburg at or above a certain altitude. That's kind of a repeat of the last scenario. But since Martinsburg, by definition, must be on an airway for it to have been a feeder here, let's assume that we were on an airway heading towards Martinsburg. The approach clearance might be very different. It'll be a little bit more basic. It could just be cleared VOR alpha approach. And if we can assume for a minute that the MEA on the airway that we're on over here to the west is, say, 4,000 feet, and let's assume we're currently at 5,000 feet. So we're trucking along eastbound on this airway heading towards Martinsburg at 5,000 feet, and the controller says cleared VOR alpha approach. Okay, we know what the lateral guidance is going to be. We know we're going to go to Martinsburg, Frederick, course reversal, head inbound, and shoot the approach. What altitudes can we use? And there's several key altitudes. There's the altitude we're at now, which is 5,000. The question is then, what altitude can we now descend to between our present position and Martinsburg? And that is in this. Now remember, the controller didn't give us any help here, and this confuses a lot of pilots. And you, in this case, can use the MEA for the airway that you're on. So if we're at 5 and they clear us for the approach, and the MEA was 4, then you can descend down to 4. Do not request it from the controller. You don't have to. So don't say, well, what altitude do you want me at? Well, he's already told you you've been cleared for the approach. He's not legally, or she's not legally obliged to provide you with an altitude either. The only time you need to be provided with that altitude if you were on a random route. So if you had been receiving vectors, or you're not on a published airway, let's say right here where my mouse is, literally over the river, they're not going to, and you're heading towards direct Martinsburg, they're not going to say cleared VOR alpha approach by itself. It's not a legal clearance. And in that case, you should push back on the controller and say, what altitude would you like me to maintain between now and Martinsburg? And because there is no MEA that applies. So we're at 5, we can descend to 4, we cross Martinsburg, we can descend down to 3,500 based on this plate till we get to Frederick. Crossing Frederick, heading outbound, we're allowed to descend down to 2,000 300 while maneuvering for the procedure turn. So 5,000 down to 4,000, cross Martinsburg down to 3,500, cross Frederick, descend to 23, begin the maneuvering. We're now heading inbound on the approach. And as soon as we join the 220 course, sorry, it is the 220, it's not the 220 radial. What radial is that? That'd be the 040 radial. There it is. I just had to scroll up. 040 radial. Now we can descend down from 23 down to 1360 until we cross Niort, assuming we can identify it. If we can't identify Niort, let's say we only have one VOR receiver and no RNAV capability, then 1360 is as low as we go and be reflected in the minimums here, 1360. If we can identify Niort, more power to us, we're allowed to drop down to 920. Any questions about that aspect of it before we cover what that special C means in the circling? Alrighty.
No questions.
There are or there are not?
Well, there wasn't when I said that, and now there is.
Okay, thanks. Was the 4,000 assigned by the controller or was it indicated elsewhere? For this scenario, we had said the MEA, let's assume the MEA for the airway that we were on when we were west of Martinsburg was 4,000. So the 4,000 is not published on this plate, nor is it assigned by the controller. It was the MEA for the airway we're on, which, by the way, is a great reason to know the MEAs for the airways that you're on. It is tempting sometimes to not have low en route charts. You just enter the information into your GPS, build the flight plan, and then you're fat, dumb, and happy following the pretty purple line. If you don't know the MEA for the airway you're on, it can cause some problems. And one of these problems would be if you receive an approach clearance, you don't know what altitude you can descend to. Thomas said, do you drop to 960 after Niort or before? Well, if we're heading inbound, we're dropping from 23 to 1360. There is a minimum crossing altitude of 1,360 feet at Niort. So by definition, you cannot drop to 920 before Niort because it says right there that you've got to be at 1360 or above. Okay. So circling minimums have been recently changed. So the distance that you need to maintain from the airport varied with the category of aircraft. I believe it was 1.3, 1.5, 1.7, 1.9, and then I'm not positive about the 1.9, but then so category D and E were either 1.9 and 2 point something, or category D was 2.3 and then category E was something much bigger than that. But I know the first three were 1.3, 1.5, 1.7, I think, for category A, B, and C. Those are the distances that you need to, that's as far as you can be from the airport, no further than that, at the circling minimums while receiving the terrain protection that they give. So to be very, very clear, you can be down at 1,360 feet while you're circling around the airport, but you obviously can't take that to an extreme. You can't just simply wander 15 miles away from Frederick while you're circling and not expect to hit anything. So those numbers, which are unfortunately not published on the charts, are things that you just have to either study or commit to memory during the training, which is, okay, how far am I allowed to be from the airport and still receive the terrain clearance? So those numbers I mentioned were the old traditional numbers. They have recently published new circling minimums, which allow you to go considerably further away from the airport than the numbers I just gave. So rather than for a category A approach, it being 1.3 nautical miles, I don't know the specific figure. I only saw them recently, but I remember it being a very large jump, close to double, something like that. Peter, since you posted this, I'm guessing you probably have the information in front of you. First of all, did I get that right? Is it 1.3, 1.5, 1.7 for the category A, B, and C, the old numbers, and if not, what are those old numbers, and then what are the new numbers?
You have the old numbers right. It's 1.3, 1.5, 1.7. The category D, just for the record, is 2.3, and E is 4.5, if you happen to fly a category E aircraft. The new minimums depend on the altitude of the approach now. So there are there's no quick and easy number. For category A and B, it's actually not that different. Category A is the same until you reach an MDA of 7,000 feet. Category B, it's between 1.7 and 2.0 now. And then it gets much significantly higher for category C, D, and E, where the biggest changes are. So for the most part, it doesn't really change much, but it's just something that can confuse you if you don't know what it is.
So can you repeat the category A number? Is it still 1.3 if the altitude of the airport is less than 7,000 feet?
Correct. It's still 1.3.
Oh, wow. Okay. And you said the category B is now 1.7 or 1.9?
It's 1.7 if you're below 1,000 feet, 1.8 between 1,000 feet and 5,000 feet, 1.9 to 7,000 feet, 2.0 to 9,000 feet, and 2.1 above that.
I see. I assume this is to deal with the higher true airspeed of the aircraft if you're flying at those altitudes?
Exactly. That's the exact reason cited.
I see. Wow. As if circling wasn't confusing enough. Okay, so for the purposes of this, I would not, the goal of this is not necessarily to make everybody a master of circling. So I'm really glad you mentioned it because this is my first time actually seeing it. I'd read the new regs and I knew there was going to be a notation for it. I just had never seen one on an actual plate, so that's very good. So if you're able to take nothing else away from this, I know it was a flood of numbers and we didn't write them down, so they're very hard to track. Just know that there's an old set of circling minimums and a new set of circling minimums in terms of the distances involved, and the new circling minimums allow for slightly greater distances under some circumstances. The specifics of them are not critical, but they apparently mostly based on altitude of the airport. So I think Peter makes a good point, which is just don't be too intimidated when you see the C. There's nothing worse than when you're trying to brief an approach than seeing a symbol where you have no idea what it means. It can be a real confidence shaker. So don't walk away from this feeling bad if you don't know what all the numbers were that we just quoted, because I certainly didn't know half the numbers that I was quoting. I was guessing at the category D and E, as you could remember, because I don't fly a category D and E aircraft. Just in case anyone's alarmed, like, okay, why doesn't he know those numbers? It's because I'm flying a category A and B aircraft generally. Sometimes C if I'm feeling sporty, but mostly A and B. So there's now a whole new set of circling minimums that grow and shrink depending on the altitude of the airport. So if you were heading into a high density altitude airport and you were going to shoot a circling approach and you wanted that extra distance that these new minimums afford, that is a great time to go and look that up. Otherwise, I would probably not sweat it too much because you'll drive yourself nuts trying to remember those numbers. I have to admit, I had to look at those numbers, the 1.3, 5, 7, 2.3, 4.5 progression, a whole bunch of times before I could recall even the first three from memory. And as you can see, I got very shaky on the D&E as well. So there's really only so much you can memorize, at least in my opinion. So how much of that is worth exactly memorizing, I'm not sure, but it's definitely worth learning that there are two different types of circling minimums, the new and the old.
Quick question, Keith.
Yes.
Why are the, assuming you cannot identify New York, why are these circling minimums for faster aircraft lower than slower aircraft?
That is an excellent question. I have never before seen that in my life. Okay. Yeah, my goal is not to find really super tricky approaches. It's to hopefully do rapid fire. This is like rapid fire with a musket, which is to say not rapid fire at all. It was a good one, though. I'm glad you introduced the new circling minimums. Even I had not seen that. I was hoping to find one. So that's good. Okay, the LDA 19, all right. we had mentioned LDA very, very briefly on the list of approach types a couple of workshops ago, but we had never actually looked at a plate. An LDA is a localizer directional aid. That's what it stands for, and it is essentially a localizer. The same thing we used for the localizer 19 right at John Wayne. It is just not necessarily aligned with the runway as precisely as a localizer is. Sorry, for a traditional localizer approach, those are very closely aligned with the heading of the runway. LDAs not so much. And so you can see the difference between the final approach course on this, which is 181. We can get that in two places. We can see it on this profile right here, which says 181. It's also published up here in the briefing plate. And it's for runway 19 right. Peter, do you happen to remember what the maximum offset can be for an LDA? Is it up to about 30 degrees?
The maximum or the minimum?
Oh, sorry, the minimum. Yeah. How far does it have to be off? How far can it be off before it transitions from a localizer approach to an LDA?
3 degrees.
That's it. Okay, so localizers are really, really closely aligned with the runway then.
Yeah, 3's limit, and that's a fun final note with that VR alpha. There's a NOTAM that fixes that whole thing and makes it 1360 for CND. So it made it.
That's hysterical. I hope we can edit that video at the end then and cut out that whole discussion and say it's a misprint.
Yeah, actually, they got rid of the C comment too in the NOTAM, so it might be they just released it early. So when they re-release it, that still may be the case. We just don't know. It's very weird though at minimum.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So the LDA 19 right. How would we fly this fella? This is a interesting approach because we don't have much in the way of initial approach fixes or feeders. Oh, we do. I'm sorry. There's Tusty. Very good. Okay. So Seal Beach is not a feeder and not an initial approach fix on this. So the approach is not flyable from Seal Beach, which might be counterintuitive when you see that it's using, we have 3 radials off of Seal Beach. And each time we've seen this, like on the ILS and the localizer plate, at least one of them has been flyable, right? Remember the Seal Beach one? It went off to Sega, and that was the flyable route because it had a distance and all that good stuff. We can tell instantly looking at this because of the thin type. These are clearly just radials, but there's no distance, no MEA, and no course published on them, and so these are not flyable. So this approach is not flyable from Seal Beach. You will not have a controller say cross Seal Beach at or above an altitude cleared LDA 19 right. So you're not going to fly it from there. But the approach is flyable from Tusty. So let's have a look at how we do that. Now you might be forgiven for saying, okay, an LDA approach. Okay, I don't have an LDA in my airplane. It's not a new type of nav aid. Again, this is a localizer that is, which is essentially you just tune that into your nav 1 or nav 2, and there it is right there, 108.3. It just happens that the course of that localizer is more than 3 degrees offset from the heading of the runway. And thank you to Peter for supplying with the information about the 3 degrees. Okay, so from Tusty, it's going to be however we got here. We could have been cleared direct Tusty if we have our nav. We may well have been told to fly from Seal Beach on the 080 radial. However we get to Tusty, whatever the means are, it's not very interesting. At this point, we've done enough approaches from random points, whether it's here, 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 or here. As long as we get to Tusty, all that matters is what we do next, which is we join the localizer outbound for a minute. We'd execute our course reversal if we're doing the full approach, and join the final approach course inbound. And from then, it is a non-precision approach. Okay, let's look at our altitudes associated with that.
So Keith, part of my question really was about the how do you get to Tusty part, so we can come back to that if you want.
Okay, no, it's important then. If my assumption's incorrect about it not being very interesting prior to Tusty, then fire away.
So if we've got GPS in the airplane, then that's easy. I'm thinking about the case where we don't. Is there any way to get there without being vectored?
Without being vectored, you mean to the final approach course, or receiving
Yes.
some vectors to Tusty?
Right, receiving vectors to Tusty or being vectored, well, yes, let's just say that, being vectored to Tusty. Can you get there otherwise?
Yes, you could. You could be west of Seal Beach, and they could say after Seal Beach, join the Seal Beach 080 radial to Tusty. That's, I believe that would be legal. They don't have to give you a heading necessarily, so you could use something other than RNAV to get to Tusty. They would just, the thing is, the approach is not flyable from Seal Beach, so they couldn't clear you from the approach with Seal Beach being the last fix in terms of course guidance. So they could say, maintain whatever it's down, or cross Tusty at or above 3,000 cleared LDA 19 right approach, assuming they had told you what to do after Seal Beach.
And real quick, Victor 64 goes to Tusty from Seal Beats.
Oh, that is handy.
Yeah, you need the plate to know that, but yeah, if you go from Seal Beats, Victor 64, Tusty's the 11 DME fix on the airway.
Okay, so in that case, so your cleared route of flight, in this case, your cleared route of flight, let's assume you're cleared via on Victor 64, then your cleared route of flight is taking you over an initial approach fix. So you actually could be cleared for the approach prior to Seal Beach in that case, only because you have everything you need to be able to get to Tusty in that case. But if Tusty was not on an airway, then it is still true that they could give you course guidance after Seal Beach referencing radials that got you to Tusty. So you don't it's not necessarily the case that just because you can't go GPS direct to Tusty that you're out of options. The controller could still give you other means of getting there, but the controller would have to give you an altitude to maintain the whole way to Tusty, except for the fact that Tusty is on an airway, as it turns out.
Okay, that makes sense now, thanks.
Another way to do it might be if you had ADF equipment on board, potentially. They could clear you direct MAJ, because MAJ is a locator middle marker. There's a compass locator there. And if you're receiving it, you could go direct MAJ, and they could tell you to join the localizer outbound at MAJ. I suppose they could also vector you to join the localizer outbound. These are really extreme cases, by the way. I mean, if they're vectoring you to join a localizer, it's not going to be to fly the full approach from Tusty. They'd just vector you to final to begin with. But as an academic discussion, these are all valid ways of getting to Tusty under some form of pilot navigation. Okay. So from Tusty, real quick, we've drawn the lateral way that it would be flown. So in terms of vertical, we'd maintain whatever altitude they told us to maintain until Tusty, unless we were actually cleared to fly on Victor 64, in which case we could use the MEA if they didn't give us another altitude. And so for the course reversal, we're going to maintain 3,000 till we're established inbound on the approach. Once we're established inbound, we've got some step downs, which is kind of relatively rare to see step downs outside the final approach fix. So once established, we'll do all our maneuvering at 3,000, join the final approach course inbound, then we cross FE at or above 23, we cross Tusty at or above 1.6, that's our final approach fix, then we cross Gower at or above 880, then we come down to the MDA, of which there are 4 different ones. So there are MDAs based on whether we're doing straight in or a circling, and let's assume we're doing the straight in for 19 right, so these are straight in minimums for 19 right, and in which case we distinguish between whether we're able to identify Gower or not. So the basic straight in minimums are going to be 880 for an MDA. Otherwise, if we can identify Gower, and I can think of 3 ways to identify Gower, then we can descend down as low as 480. And the 3 ways to identify Gower: it's 2 miles on the DME for the localizer. You can see because it says IOJW and 2. So Gower, localizer 2 DME is Gower. The Seal Beach 0907 radial is also Gower. And the third would be if you have GPS. So if you have, or an RNAV capability that's capable of identifying Gower, that would do it too. So that will allow you to drop down to 480 feet. Now what we haven't covered is the vectors to final case. So if we're looking at this and we know that John Wayne is typically a radar environment, let's try and remember some basic guidelines about what the controller is going to give us for vectors to final. So the final approach fix, that's why it's important to identify what the final approach course is. Sorry, the final approach fix is Tusty. So all the action is going to happen in terms of vectoring outside of Tusty. So several miles outside of Tusty, the controller has to get us established. So it's going to look one of 2 ways. It's going to be a 30-degree intercept from the east, or it's going to be a 30-degree intercept, practically speaking, from the west. If you rely on those assumptions, you'll be right about 99% of the time. So it's going to be a 150 heading to intercept if we're coming from the west to the east, or if we're already on the east side and we're heading west, it'll be a 210 heading. So again, anything you can do to anticipate what your approach clearance is going to be is just going to make your life that much easier. You know, if you've got it in your head that it's going to be a 150 heading because we're out, you know, we're being vectored from Seal Beach. So Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo departs Seal Beach heading 040 vectors LDA 19 right final approach course. So you do that, you can instantly work out, okay, this is going to be a 150. That's going to be my final, the final heading. So once they've got us on 090 or 100, something like that, you're heading southeast, the next thing you're anticipating is the vector to final, which should be a 150 heading. Let's say you hear Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, 6 from Tusty, fly heading 250, maintain 2,000 till established or 3,000 till established, cleared LDA 19 right approach. Are you really going to fly a 250 heading because you heard 250? What are the chances that the controller actually said 250 versus, you know, maybe it was a, you know, let's assume it was poor radio reception. You think you heard 250, but really you're expecting 150. So it's much more likely that it's 150. You could clarify it if you wanted to. I mean, the course of action you take is really up to you there. But the fact that you're expecting to hear 150 and you got something radically different to it, i.e. 250, well, really it should have been more on that heading then, to the southwest, it's a red flag. So having that number in your head arms you with information and it allows you to spot red flags a little bit easier, as opposed to what you might be forgiven for doing, which is just blindly following any heading they give you, even on the approach clearance. So good luck flying a 250 heading and being able to intercept the localizer when you're on the west side of it. But that situational awareness is going to be very important anytime you're being vectored to final. But in any case, we get the 150 heading, we maintain whatever altitude that we were told till we're established on final. Once we are established on final, you may be able to drop prior to the next fix. This happens all the time when we're vectoring people. We have to keep you at the minimum vectoring altitude. Let's say for argument's sake that it's 3,000 feet. So if we say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo 6 from Tusty, and we're over here, 6 from Tusty, fly heading 150, maintain 3,000 till established on the final approach course, cleared LDA, runway 19 right approach. So here we go, 150, 3,000 feet. So when do you drop from 3,000 and what do you drop to? You might be forgiven for thinking you stay at 3,000 until you get to Tusty. Well, that's a shame because the actual crossing altitude at Tusty was at or above 1.6. So we missed an opportunity to descend much sooner. So once you're established on the localizer, you need to know where you are on that localizer. Are we inside? Are we inside or outside of FE? Because FE is a step down. If you're outside of FE, then from 3,000, which is what the controller gave us, you could drop to 23. If you intercepted inside of FE, then you could drop all the way down to 1,600. So you need to be thinking about that as you're joining the localizer, which is, okay, where am I in reference to these step downs? What do I go to next? So that's actually a bit more work to do.
But you
But there we
can't.
go.
But you can actually drop down to 2300 without really thinking about it until you figure out whether you're inside or outside FE.
Yes, correct. You could do that.
One last quick question then is about this whole approach. Why does it exist at all?
I'm not 100% positive. I don't have a definitive answer for that. I've wondered the same thing myself, especially since it didn't exist the next plane properly. Practically doesn't exist for us up until recently. I'm not sure if it's a legacy approach or if it is a backup in case the localizer fails at John Wayne. So John Wayne's a very, very busy airport. You know, it has transport category aircraft going in and out of there all the time. Prior to the advent of GPS, if that localizer went out, your choices were slim for what you could shoot there. So the only guess I can think of is that this was added as a redundant step for the, in case the ILS, the localizer associated with the ILS went out. That's the only thing that jumps to mind. Anyone else know why there's an LDA here?
Noise abatement. It's actually preferred to the ILS because it offsets for noise abatement.
So are they using this on a regular basis?
Yes, I've done this approach in real life, preferred over the ILS when they'll advertise this one before the ILS normally.
So if the minimums allow, if the weather is not that bad, they're going to have everyone doing the LDA and no one will be doing the ILS by default?
That's the preference, yeah. It's sort of a weird, once again, sort of a weird case, but yeah, they prefer it for the noise abatement.
Wow, okay. Do you happen to know, I'm just curious, is it more of a nighttime thing, an after hours, or even in daylight hours?
I don't know the time of day, to be honest. All I really know is that it's noise abatement. I'm looking in the docs that we have to see if there's anything that says why in our paperwork, but as far as I know, it's all noise abatement.
Wow, okay. I wouldn't have even guessed it. I know at San Francisco they have some approaches, charted visuals that are used for noise abatement. In fact, there's a VOR, I'm trying to remember which segment of the approach looks really, really bizarre and it's very difficult to fly. You'll actually see the runway from a long way out, but the approach has you offset. It keeps you basically over the water, further over the water and further away from the land, specifically for noise as well. The San Francisco 0905 radio, I just can't remember which approach it was. So yeah, I'd never guessed that the LDA was for that. That makes sense now. Okay, so we covered how to fly this approach from Tusty, full approach with the vertical and horizontal, and also the vectors to final. I'm realizing that it's a little bit too lofty of a goal to talk about the nav radio setups for every approach. We will not have the time, so I'm going to skip doing that. I think, quite honestly, it's sort of the least important or least new part of this, and I think people can probably work out what would be effective to tune at different phases of flight. What is sometimes less obvious is, again, that primary concern is, where are we flying the plane? You know, can you draw a course that makes sense for the approach? Yeah, unlike the thing I just drew there. That is really important, and what altitudes are you going to step down to and when? Those are, if you can get that, you're in very good shape. What things to tune and what frequencies to use is really more of the second skill, which is, how am I going to fly it in this airplane with the equipment that we have? Okay, Mark, we good on the LDA?
Yes, thank you.
All right. You know, I haven't looked at one missed approach yet. I've really been ignoring the missed approaches, so let me have a real quick look at this missed approach segment. See if there's anything interesting. Not especially, no. So when you're briefing the approach, you'd obviously look at the missed approach that's published, unless you're Delta. If you're a Delta pilot, congratulations, you don't have to even brief the missed approach, which I recently learned. I think that's hysterical, but for the rest of us, we have to brief the missed approaches. So this one is continue straight ahead to 1,000 feet and climbing right turn to 3,000, heading to Seal Beach. And then you would expect to get instructions prior to Seal Beach. So nothing too remarkable going on there. Okie dokie.
You're covering your microphone or something.
Oh, thank you. I just had my finger in a random spot. It turned out to be the microphone on this laptop. Mr. Reese, good evening. Mr. Reese has brought before us a localizer-backed course, runway 14, with a DME arc. Were you and Peter separated at birth by any chance? All right, so Reese...
That works fun. It just looks...
was there any specific elements of this which you wanted a specific focus on, or just the general same thing? How would it be flown from the different points? Well, I know we haven't actually covered arcs yet, nor have we covered back courses, so there'll be new stuff there. My only concern is the time. I got about we have about 20-ish minutes left, but this is also very good stuff. The DME arc is something I wanted to cover, as well as back courses.
No, I didn't have anything specific. I just thought it was an interesting approach.
Okay, okay. Fort Wayne's near your part of the world, isn't it?
Affirmative.
One thing that jumps out right away is this note here, the Category E procedure term not authorized. So if you were flying a Category E aircraft, so again, you're in your SR-71 that you've stolen, the least of your problems would be that you can't shoot the Category E procedure term. But it's interesting that that notes like that exist. So you can still shoot this approach with Category E, and you could do the full approach, but not from, let's see, where is the initial approach fix on this? We have one here on the arc, but where is the, I need a second here. I'm struggling to find the initial approach fix. Oh, I see. Okay, I got it. Okay, so Fort Wayne is a feeder. That's what took me a second. I was expecting to see IAF. It's still a little weird because Wizard is not published as an IAF. Peter, what am I getting wrong on this? I mean, it looks like Fort Wayne is actually a feeder because there is a flyable segment to Wizard, but Fort Wayne was not labeled as an IAF, so I expected Fort Wayne was a feeder with Wizard being an IAF, and we're doing the course reversal around Wizard, but no.
Now the course reversal is around Wizard. I don't know why it's not an IF. It should be an IF. I'm guessing, and this is really a guess, that it's because you can't identify it on any en route segment, and most IFs have to be identifiable in an en route segment. But the procedure turn is based on Wizard. You can tell that officially. If you drop down to the profile view, you can see that the procedure turn goes out from Wizard, that 100-foot drop.
Yeah, that part I saw. I was just very confused as to why Wizard wasn't labeled as an IAF. Gotcha. Okay. So Fort Wayne is technically a feeder, right?
Yeah, Fort Wayne's definitely a feeder to Wizard. And the fact that there's a feeder to it and it's not labeled as an IF is a little bit weird. Because that's allowable in that case to make it an IF as far as I know. I'm gonna double check that while we chat though.
Okay. So there'd be two ways that this would be flyable, and this looks a lot more complex than it actually is. So you may get really paranoid when you look at this and go, okay, am I going to be doing a procedure turn that's involving an arc? And the answer is no. So there are two distinct ways this could be flown, and well, three if you include vectors to final, but let's skip that, and we'll just do, where did my annotations go? There we go. So if we treat it as two separate cases, let's do the one that's most familiar, which is course reversal. So you go from Fort Wayne to, I'm going to offset this slightly just to make it more readable, to Wizard. And the reason we know that it's flyable from here is because of this notation here, this little notation here, 2,700 feet to Wizard on a course of 316 for 6.5. I know I've said this a billion times, but we'll make it 1,000,001,000. If you see that information, that means it's a flyable route. So the fact that it's giving us an altitude and a course and a distance means this is flyable. And that's what I was, again, this is me looking at this plate for the first time. So I'm trying to find out where this is flyable from, and it was when I saw, I didn't see Fort Wayne and assume it was flyable from there. I was actually running my line of sight up and down this course looking for something that looked flyable, and it was actually those 3 pieces of information that jumped out, and it was only then that I linked them to Fort Wayne. So that's how important that can be when you're trying to debug these charts. Okay, so we've got our course to here, and then it's a course reversal to the southwest, so we head on out, we do our outbound turn, make a 180, come back in, and Bob's your uncle. So from a lateral standpoint, that's pretty standard. Let's see if there's anything hairy on the vertical. Right, so we start at 2700 crossing Wizard. We're allowed to descend to 2600, thanks for that massive 100-foot drop. During the course reversal, once we're established inbound, we cannot drop any lower, so that's interesting. We get a 100-foot drop during the maneuvering, but once the maneuvering is done, we still sit at 2600. Great. And all of that is gotten from this approach plate right here. The reason, notice that the 2600 here on the left matches the 2600 here. That's what tells us that we can't drop any further once we're established inbound. So this number over here is the altitude during the maneuvering, and then once we're on that 138 course right here, you can see it's drawn as a totally flat line. We still got to stay at 2600. And then from there it's a descent down to the MDA, which varies based on whether it's straight in or circling, and then you've got the 2 numbers there. So vertically not too much going on, except for the fact that there's no additional descent once you're established on the localizer. A mistake then would be, as soon as you're established, to drop down to the MDA. You've got to stay at the 2600 till you cross Wizard. Okay, so ignoring the fact that this is a back course for a minute, which is kind of evil, that's relatively straightforward, just with that one small caveat on the vertical profile. So now let's talk about the arc portion. We haven't really talked about DME arcs before. Can't go into massive detail on how to fly a DME arc right now with the time we have, but this is a no procedure turn segment. So that 2600 no PT, hopefully you'll remember from our multiple reviews of the ILS approach at John Wayne, segments can be marked with a no PT label, which means that if there is a published procedure turn, it will not be flown. So this is very similar to the case that Mike brought up at the very beginning. If this did not say no PT on it, we would fly the arc. Let's ignore the fact that we don't know how to fly these yet, but so we're assuming that we do. We would, now we're talking about Mike's case, where you're established essentially inbound on the course. You would then have to do this bow tie reversal all the way back around, come back over here, spin it back around again, and pass out from exhaustion. That's obviously not great. I'm trying desperately to delete this annotation stand by. There we go. So instead, that's why we have the no PT label, and so that would be one of those 5 cases in which the published procedure turn does not need to be flown. And the big one on that list is if the segment you're on is marked as an OPT segment. So instead, we're going to fly the arc, and we're going to maintain 16 DME from the Fort Wayne VOR, which is over here. So it's basically a curved segment. I'll just do this with a mouse, I think, for clarity, to follow Mike's lead. So we'll follow the arc until we hit the lead radial. You'll notice there is a LR308. It's very different than the R279 label that's down here. So this initial approach fix is on the Fort Wayne 279 radial at 16 DME. We continue on the arc until we cross the 308 radial. That's a significant part. That tells us when we can lead our turn. If we don't begin a turn for the localizer at that point, if we simply were to remain on the arc till we hit the localizer, then attempted to join the localizer, there's a really good chance you're going to overshoot it. So the procedure designers publish a lead radial, which gives you a heads up that says, okay, as we're crossing this radial, the 308 radial, also called the lead radial, that is your cue to start making a turn towards the localizer. That way you minimize the overshoot of it. So that's how you fly the arc. There's no procedure turn at that point. You could then drop down from 2600, sorry, you'd remain at 2600. So the two ways of getting established on this final approach course inbound at 2600 are to do the procedure turn that's published here from Wizard, or you do not have to do the procedure turn if you follow this arc onto the approach. That covers most of what's interesting about this, except for one thing, which is that it's a back course approach. So there is almost certainly an ILS approach at this airport for runway 32, most likely, and it would be flown here from the south east heading to the northwest. So there is an ILS that exists there almost certainly. This approach uses the back course of that ILS out over here. The significance of that, you don't need any special equipment to fly it, but you need a very special mindset to fly it. So you'd still tune 109.9, but now you're going to get reverse sensing. So you're going to have to actually fly away from the needle. We don't really have time to go into flying back courses, but that would be a fairly treacherous approach if you were not prepared for it. Between flying the arc to get established, you're then looking for reverse indications on the localizer. So normally you fly towards the needle, i.e. if the needle is on the left, then you turn left until the needle moves in. In this case, you would need to turn right if the needle is on the left, unless you have equipment that helps you cancel out that reversing effect. But you'll see the procedure designers go to some length to remind you that you're flying a back course approach. So congratulations, Reese. That's one of the most evil approaches I've seen in a little while.
So Keith, quick question.
Of course.
This is the particular approach plate it's very distinct at the bottom. It says DME or radar required, and you see that on approach plates all the time. But I'm not 100% clear on the distinction, because they don't mean radar in your airplane, right?
Right. It means you need to be that you need to be receiving radar services, from what I recall. I have to be honest, I kept looking this up because I kept forgetting the definition as well. But I believe it's you have to be receiving radar services. Is that correct, Peter, that you have to be receiving radar services, that if you don't have DME?
Oh yes, that's correct. It's ATC radar services. The reason being is how would you identify where Wizard is otherwise? So if you don't have DME, you need someone to physically tell you where it is, which requires ATC to have you on their radar.
And so if your equipment type indicated that you did not have DME, would they automatically call Wizard and also, I guess, NUYIC for you?
They would. Whether it's automatic or not depends on how on the game the controller is. I would not assume it's automatic and remind the controller that they'll need to do that. They will not identify NUYIC. You'll notice it doesn't have the radar tag on it, which then poses the question, how do you know you're there? And you'll notice there's a timing table on the bottom left corner. So when you got to Wizard, you'd start a timer. Based on your speed, when the time expired, you would then know you're at NUYIC.
Yes, that makes sense. So if you did have DME, but for some reason you were not receiving DME, then you would notify ATC about that fact while you were still outside Wizard, so they could call it for you.
Yes, that's correct.
I was actually in a case like that, Mark, once on an approach in the northeast, and my GPS was out at the time. In fact, I was flying to a maintenance facility at that airport to get the GPS antenna replaced. And it was pretty horrific weather, and I was in that same boat where I could really use some help identifying a fix, and I believe it was labeled as a radar fix. And I specifically said to the controller, hey, I'm flying uniform right now. Would you mind identifying these two fixes for me and let me know? And she did. I don't think that the label saying radar doesn't necessarily mean they will mention it for you. I think it means that they can mention it. You know, that they will have that fix depicted on their scope. It's within the radar coverage area, all of that good stuff. So they can identify it. Doesn't mean you necessarily will have them identify it for free. You may have to call them on it. Ironically, this becomes a relatively simple approach if you're getting vectors to final. So much of this goes away. Procedure turn gone. DME arc gone. It just becomes a straight back course approach, and we know that, let's see, wizard is the final approach fix, so all the action is going to happen outside of wizard. We're going to get a vector to final. It's either going to be 108, 108, they'll never actually assign 108, it'll probably be 110 or maybe, 110. Or coming from the other way, it would be 170. So we're either going to get a 170 to intercept or a 110 to intercept, and probably at 2600 till established. So the controller will do the job of the DME arc or the procedure turn. And so if you're in a radar environment, which you most likely will be when you're shooting this, the likelihood of you having to do the approach from the with the arc is relatively slim, I would think, in a production environment. Reese, do you happen to know, is this in your part of the world? And if so, do you know if you can expect it to be vector to final on this one?
Oh yeah, Fort Wayne has regional jets all the time, but they're always vectored.
Good. Okay. That's a nice one. So we covered how to fly it with all the cases. Let's see, the mist. Yeah, the mist gets even more exciting. So the mist is a hold around a compass locator outer marker. So if you don't have, you could do it with ADF, right? So if you have an ADF, that'll work to identify Hoagie, or you could do it with DME. So you just be on the localizer till 4.3 DME, or you can use GPS for Hoagie. Okie dokie, let's keep on going for a few more minutes. I'm hoping that one of the things that's coming across is, despite the radical variety in the approaches we're shooting, so we've done a VR alpha, we've done a localizer back course, we did the LDA, so many of the techniques, especially for the vector to final and the course reversal, they're all carrying across regardless of the approach type. I'm hoping that's something that you're noticing. So as long as you get really confident about, okay, how do we execute the course reversal? What altitudes do we maintain during the course reversal? Then whether you're using a localizer to identify the final approach course, or a VOR, or an NDB for that matter, the concepts are generally the same. So I'm hoping that's coming across in this review. So if it's starting to feel repetitive and a little bit boring, it's actually a good thing, believe it or not. So if you're feeling like, okay, yeah, this is just like the last one, can we move on? That's awesome. That means that you're not seeing as much variety, not as many surprises, and you'll know what to do when you're running your finger over those 150 approach plates that everyone has to do.
The common thread on all of these has been not how to fly the approach, it's how the heck do you get onto the approach course.
Yeah, that's a good point. Once you're established on the final approach course inbound, then it's either a precision or it's a non-precision. It just happens that today we've been doing mostly non-precisions, but that's correct. Okay, there's one more. We'll do Mercy wants to do McGregor, and then we'll let me see if there are any other texts. Then I duo Moon 1 approach. Good. Oh, Moon says he's not bored yet. Shoot. Okay. Arnev 17. How interesting, because the approach that I had to fly was an Arnev 17 approach too. So you'll notice I said Arnev 17. I did not say Arnev GPS runway 17. When you request it, you can call it anything you like, but when a controller refers to it, they're not supposed to pronounce the portion that's in parentheses. So you might do well to also do the same thing and just call it the RNAV runway 17 when you're verbally referring to it. Okie dokie, let's see what's interesting about this fella.
Keith, is that just a legacy thing that area nav approaches were around of some types before GPS was the most common one?
I can't remember the exact progression, but there were RNAV approaches that did not require GPS, so you could use VOR-based area navigation. I remember Truckee up in Northern California had one of those approaches. It may still have it. So that was just a straight RNAV approach. This is an RNAV approach that that requires the use of GPS. But the reason they don't call it a GPS runway 17 approach is that for a long time, GPS approaches were typically overlays, at least that's my understanding, of existing approaches. So this RNAV, at some point they moved to a new style that I think also involves the standard T, where you have the different base areas where you can be established on a segment of the approach without actually flying over a specific fix. It's more within a quadrant. My understanding is that concept was only introduced once they moved to the new style of RNAV approaches. So the difference between this being the GPS 17 approach versus the RNAV runway 17 approach that actually requires GPS, it is significant. There is a difference. So that's why they have that naming convention. Peter, am I right in that vague recollection of how these things came about?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated. This actually isn't a standard T1 because it'd have a TAA in that case. It looks like a standard T, but it's actually technically not one, but that doesn't really matter for this. Yeah, that has to do with naming because there's about 4 different types of RNAV approaches. They're trying to get to what they call the RNP standard, and this is just the way they're doing that. It's really from a pilot point of view, whether it's the RNAV runway so-and-so or the GPS so-and-so, really for a pilot it has to do with WASP capability. RNAV approaches are WASP capable, pure GPS approaches are generally not. That's the only real piloty difference.
Gotcha. When they did introduce TAAs, which is what I was getting at with the base areas and not having a specific fix, but actually having a quadrant, those are specific, aren't they, to the RNAV notations, the newer style? Are there any GPS overlay approaches that had the TAA capability?
No. They invented the standard T and the TAAs at the same time that they moved to the first WASP approach. I remember the first one was at the airport I used to fly at Prescott, which is why I know a bit about the details on that. So while this has all the looks of a standard T and a TA, it's technically not, but it's very close to one. You could almost get away with calling it a modified T, but it's just technically not.
Right. It actually doesn't have the TAA. It doesn't have those quadrants that I was describing anyway. So you literally do have to use the fixes. There are no actual published quadrants on this one, right?
Correct. Yeah, you have to use the fixes on this one.
Okay. All right, so let's look at it with fresh eyes and apply the concepts and see how well they hold up. There are pretty few differences on this one. So there are a couple of initial approach fixes. I see actually 3, unless I'm missing anything. Yep, so 3 initial approach fixes. We have Igor, we have IMIPE, and we have the world famous Imjuk. Yes, these RNAV fixes are almost always unpronounceable. So what is interesting about it is we have a situation that was a little bit similar to John Wayne, in that Sega, I believe, this is off the top of my head, was serving double duty. It was serving as an initial approach fix. It was also serving as an intermediate approach fix.
Yeah, you remember that.
Okay, so let's do it let's just blow it out real quick from each of these. We could be on a random route to IMPI, and the controller will say cross IMPI at or above whatever the MVA is in that area. Or if the MVA is lower than 3,000, they'll just use 3,000. Let's say the MVA was 2,000 in this area, which it may well be. It looks pretty darn flat. I take it back. There's a 1,300-foot obstacle just over there, so not as flat as I thought. All right, so we get cross MP at or above 3,000, or we'll make it interesting. Cross MP at or above 4,000, cleared RNAV runway 17 approach. So let's go real quick on the vertical and horizontal aspect of that. So for horizontal, we hit the initial approach fix, we go down to IMJUK. We don't do the hold in lieu of procedure turn because it says no PT up there. So we join the final approach course at IMJUK, and Bob's your uncle. Same thing, sorry, for vertical guidance then, we'd cross it at 4 because that's what the controller told us to do. Then we can drop down to 3, delete the annotations. So 4 down to 3. After IMJUK, we can drop down to 2. And from Baldy, we have a bunch of different minimums based on how the approach is being shot. So there are LPV minimums, LNAV, VNAV, there's just straight LNAV, MDA. So that would be a standard GPS non-WAS equipment, and then we have the circling minimums. I am actually not as familiar with LNAV, VNAV, because I don't have that capability in my airplane. I haven't done a whole lot of time studying it, but these are both effectively, I don't think they're technically considered precision approaches, but that's more of a regulatory distinction than anything else. They're actually flown very much like a precision approach. So you can tell by the minimums, this allows you to come down to 250 feet AGL. Not too many non-precision approaches will let you do that. So once you're at Baldy, you could then follow the vertical guidance given to you if it was being shot as an LPV or an LNAV VNAV approach. Otherwise, it's a standard non-precision approach descending down to 1,040 feet, which is about 450 feet AGL, which is pretty common for a non-precision. Go straight in. Sorry, that's a straight in approach from runway 17, and the missed approach is head to Zudis, and then the 095 track to Sati, and then there's a published hold with 4-mile legs at Sati. So I wanted to include the missed on that in one fell swoop. I know I'm blowing through the minimums really, really quickly. It's because we're slightly over time. If there's interest in those, we can look up some more information on them, the distinction between LPV and LNAV VNAV. But at a high level, these are precision, provide a precision-like capability. Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but is an LPV, sorry, if you're shooting it down to LPV minimums, it's a precision-like approach, but it's not technically a precision approach according to ICAO, is it?
Yes, that is correct. It's like a localizer precision with vertical guidance is what LPV stands for. And it's a precision approach in terms of how you fly it. LPV you can think of as GPS ILS. You're doing an ILS style approach using your GPS. But yeah, technically it's not precision for really technical reasons that are irrelevant for pilots.
Gotcha. Yep, that rings a bell. So it's flown procedurally. It's much like an ILS. It has a decision altitude or decision height that you're going to reach and then go missed, as opposed to a point over the ground that you're trying to identify, and there's certainly no timing involved in that. So it can be precision or non-precision depending on what equipment you have. For example, in my airplane, I have a Garmin 430 effectively. It's a slightly different model, but it's a Garmin 430, which is very, very common, but it doesn't have WAS capability. So for me, I'd be shooting this down to the LNAV MDA, which would be 1,040 feet. Whereas if I had a newer Garmin 530 WAS or a Garmin 430 WAS, I could come down a little bit lower. Well, 200 feet lower. Okay, let's continue. So we float from IMIP, nothing too exciting there. Igor is exactly the same, except we're going from Igor to IMJUK instead of IMIP to IMJUK. So for time reasons, I'll skip repeating everything I just said, but it's the same thing. The only thing which is marginally more interesting is if you were cleared direct IMJUK. So if we were cleared direct IMJUK from over here, let's say we were down here to the southwest. So Igor and IMIP are not very useful for us because we're so far away from them. So we might hear Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo clear direct IMJUK, cross IMJUK at or above 4,000, again for argument's sake, cleared RNAV runway 17 approach. So in that case, we are going to have to do the hold in lieu of the procedure turn. And this, at this point, is almost identical to the ILS 19 right at John Wayne if you're going direct Sega. So you would then go outbound, do the parallel hold entry, and then you're good to go. Peter, does the 4-mile leg apply? It's got 4-mile leg published there. Does that actually apply during the course? When you're flying the hold in lieu of the procedure turn, do you have to actually honor that?
No, it's a maximum. You never have to honor the force. That's always a maximum that the templates are built on for the hold.
Interesting. Okay. In all of my life flying as an instrument pilot, which is admittedly not that long, controllers seem to bend over backwards to get you to an IAF. Rather than send you to IMJUC, they tend to send you, at least in my experience, to the nearest IAF that gives you a straight in, or they'll vector you to final. There is one case which I've been holding off on mentioning for the last 2 months, but it is time to mention it, which is we have talked so far about there only being 2 ways to fly the approach. The full approach from an initial approach fix, so what we've been describing with IMIP, Igor, and even IMJUC with the course reversal, and vectors to final. Now, what would vectors to final look like on this one? Well, there's our final approach fix, Baldy. All the action's going to happen outside of Baldy, specifically just a few miles outside of Baldy normally, so we could get vectored like this, and they put us onto a 140 heading, or we come from here, and they put us onto a 200 heading. Okay, so we've got our 30-degree intercepts, life is good. Are those the only 2 options? In fact, no. This intermediate approach fix on an RNAV approach is significant. A controller could clear you direct to an intermediate approach fix as long as the intercept to it is less than 90 degrees. So if we were here and they could say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, cleared direct IMJUC, cleared RNAV runway 17 approach. It's almost unfortunate that IMJUC is acting both as an initial approach fix and an intermediate approach fix. In that case, it actually is really tragic for the purposes of the example, because what I was trying to illustrate is that if they clear you on an RNAV approach, they can clear you to an intermediate approach fix. It's not a vector to final. You're still flying the approach as it's published, as opposed to receiving a vector to the final approach course. But as long as the intercept they give you is less than 90 degrees, they can clear you direct to an intermediate approach fix. The only problem here that I'd have as a pilot is it's not entirely 100% clear. Are they clearing me to IMJUC the intermediate approach fix or to the initial approach fix? It's unlikely the controller's going to care. There are 2 things that can resolve the ambiguity. One thing is, if we were down here over the lake and they said clear direct IMJUC, then that is much more than a 90-degree intercept right there. So by definition, they're referring to IMJUC 1, let's call it that, which is IMJUC as an initial approach fix. So if we were cleared from here in the southeast, it would have been as we published there before. In this case, a teardrop entry would be appropriate, and Bob's your uncle. So we cross IMJUC twice, once as an initial, once as an intermediate. Nothing new there. Where it's less obvious, as I'm thinking about it, is when you're northeast of IMJUC and they cleared you direct there. If they said cleared straight in RNAV runway 17 approach, as Peter mentioned earlier, that would kind of clarify things a little bit. That would tell us that they're treating IMJUC as the intermediate approach fix. I've never thought about this before, this particular case, but if they didn't specify the straight in, Peter, is it pilot's discretion to interpret whether we're talking about IMJUC as an intermediate fix or IMJUC as an IAF, or if the controller doesn't specify and it's labeled as both, is there one that you're to assume over the other?
I'm not sure. I would assume initial, I'm going to double check something because I have 100% in this, but I'm double checking something in the controller books on it.
I know
Okay.
that if I got that clearance, I would ask whether they wanted me to fly the procedure turn or not.
Right. Now, I've had the opposite of this case where I've had the, actually, I have had this exact case. Yeah, not the opposite. I've been out here before, not on this particular approach, but on a representative approach, and I've been cleared direct to fix for the approach. And they've, by the way, they've put me down to 2,000 feet. So let me just check this altitude for a minute. Okay, so on this approach, it's 3,000 feet during the hold at Imjuk. I have been cleared down to, I'm thinking for a sec. I actually can't recall now what it was for the altitudes, but it actually doesn't matter too much either way in this case because we're not going to get below 3,000 during the hold in any case. So I've been given from a position where I was almost directly in line with the final approach course. I've been told essentially cleared direct Imjuk and cleared RNAV 17 approach. And I remember asking the controller, are you looking for the straight in or the hold? And he said, oh no, I want the straight in. And so the 3 or 4 times I've asked that before, 100% of the time they were looking for the straight in. Because the reality is, unless there's a plane ahead of you, they're, in fact, they wouldn't, there is actually no circumstance I can think of where they would want you to fly that hold. There's really just nothing leaping to mind. If they're giving you the approach clearance, then you're pretty much in good shape, unless they were giving you some sort of time limit for leaving the hold. But essentially, every time I've asked the controller, they've said, well, no, I want you to make the straight in. But those are the only things that are jumping out as being interesting on this approach that's different. It is also the first time we've looked at an RNAV approach in the workshop, so I'm glad that you brought that one up.
I suppose it's possible, Keith, that that the only time that they might want you to fly the procedure turn is if you were up pretty high and the procedure turn was a place that you were allowed to reduce your altitude and you couldn't get down fast enough otherwise, but that seems kind of a rare situation.
Yeah, I guess that's actually a very good point. If there were some mountains here that precluded you from getting down to 3,000, because this procedure, if nothing else, I mean, it gets you aligned with the final approach course and it gets you down to 3,000 feet safely. If you're up here at 5,000 and the controller's MVA in that area happened to be 5,000, the controller's not going to be able to descend you down to 3. So they're going to say cross Imjuk at above 5,000, clear the RNAV 17 approach. And yeah, absolutely, in that case, even though you are aligned with the final approach course, you're stuck at 5. And now you actually want to be dropping to 2. So you're way, way too high. And so yes, the hold gets you descended safely there. So in that case, that's a really, really good case. I'm really glad you brought it up. That would be a great case where flying the hold would be useful. Now, as a pilot, you care about that. Well, it doesn't actually care a great deal if you're too high. It doesn't affect the controller a great deal. But as the pilot, you would certainly be thinking, oh boy, I hope I get to fly this hold because I'm in a small measure of trouble here height-wise.
So this is another case, I think, where if the controller had cleared us direct to Imjuk and we were at 5,000, I might say, I'm going to fly the procedure turn to lose altitude.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea because, what if it was a gray area? What if their MVA was 3,500 and they said, or 3,200? Clearly he's going to expect you to make the straight in, but you might say, well, there's an altitude difference there. I'm going to do that hold. So yes, if adding some clarity to it is not a bad thing. Okay, that's the RNAV 17. Are there any more questions about that approach? Oh my, have there been a bunch more added? Okay, so there were a couple more added. All right, there's an NDB approach. We haven't seen one of those, so it would be a good idea to open that. We are going a little over, however, I really don't, I don't have anything more significant that I'm going to be adding to this in terms of course material, so I'm happy to keep going on this and treat it more as of a Q&A, if anything else, but I don't really intend for this to carry over into another workshop. So I'm going to go through all these approaches more as a Q&A at this point. But if there are, there won't be any new fundamental material being added. So if people need to go, it is okay. But I will keep going on these for now. So the NDB. Okay, so this is excellent. We have an NDB approach, which is we really haven't spent much time talking about ADFs, and yet looking at this, just almost immediately, there's just nothing. Hang on a minute. Okay, there is one thing that is exciting, but it's almost the same as what we've been talking about on all the other approaches. It's only one thing that's slightly new as a twist, other than the fact that we're using an NDB for our approach course guidance. Okay, so what do we have in terms of feeders and initial approach fixes? We have Walla Walla is an initial approach fix. Pendleton's initial approach, I'm sorry, these are feeders. Walla Walla is a feeder. Pendleton is a feeder. I knew I might be missing something. Baker City, 30 miles away, also a feeder. Oh my goodness, is Pendleton really 46 miles away? Yep, and 46 miles on Walla Walla. I'm guessing LeGrand is generally in the middle of nowhere. So these Pendleton, Walla Walla, and Baker City are feeder routes, which again take you from the highway to the driveway. So these are all where the airways are. So LeGrand may be very, very far away from other airways. So these feeders are critical, actually, very, very important. So if your route took you to Baker City and then you lost communications, it's very comforting to know that you can make it all the way from Baker City, which is 30 miles away from the airport. And in the case of Walla Walla, it's 46 miles away. Not necessarily from the airport, but from where the approach commences, close enough. It's great that you have this. You can fly this entire thing with no communications and be guaranteed of terrain and obstacle separation. There's zero ambiguity as to how you should fly this approach from Pendleton, Baker City, or Walla Walla. Okay, let's have a look. So Pendleton to the NDB, we're going to do our, going to the initial approach fix, join the final, join the course outbound, do our course reversal, come back in. The only thing that's a little bit fancy on this one is that when you hit the final approach fix, there's actually a pretty good turn on it. I'm reminded instantly of the VOR 30 approach at John Wayne, which has a 30-degree bend at the final approach fix also. It's actually a really, really important bend, and it adds to the workload considerably, because crossing the final approach fix is a very busy time on an instrument approach, and on NDB approach, if you're literally only shooting this with NDB equipment and you've been dealing with crosswinds and all sorts of things, you could really be forgiven for, once you finally get yourself established on that course, the whole time you're flying towards the NDB, you're really fixated on trying to keep everything straight and consistent. You could well be forgiven for forgetting to do the 30-degree right turn to find LeGrand. So just imagine if you're sweating during the approach and working hard because of the crosswind, you finally cross LeGrand, you start your timer, you're descending to the MDA, which is 4,360 feet. And you've got your timer going, you're trying to maintain about 60 or 90 knots over the ground, whichever it is, you're looking for the field. You descend all the way down to 4,360, you're not quite seeing the field. It's been 2 minutes and 20 seconds, you never see the field. It's because the field is about a mile off your right wing because you forgot to make the right turn to 194 there. So if the one piece of advice I'd have is if you, during briefing this approach, as I've just done, well, this was hardly a formal approach briefing, but just as we look over the approach for the first time, in terms of red flags, this was all very standard. And you notice I said that at the beginning. I caught that very, very quickly. I said, okay, this is all pretty standard. Oh, except there's one thing. So you want your eye to be tuned, or you really want to catch turns at the final approach fix, because they're really insidious. They seem so simple when you're briefing them in the comfort of your own home like this, but an NDB approach is nothing to sneeze at, and under certain circumstances it's really very, very difficult. And so you'd want to have this red flag. You'd want to remind yourself very quickly during the briefing, okay, I've got this dog leg at the final approach fix here. Otherwise it seems pretty standard. Let me see, is there anything else on this that's interesting? Oh yeah, I guess we'd talk about the case where if you were cleared to fly the approach, you could be cleared direct Legrand and fly the approach from there without using the feeders. We have covered that in the past, but normally there isn't so much distance between all these things. So you could be over here and they could clear you direct Legrand and you'd still be on the hook for flying the full approach. And I won't draw it because it's exactly the same from Legrand onwards. Just remember that just because there are feeders there, they don't have to use them. In fact, I have to be honest, most controllers don't even seem to know that feeders exist. I say that because in the New York terminal area, they constantly have me fly over a feeder, and they then clear me direct to an initial approach fix. So imagine flying over Walla Walla, and then they say, after Walla Walla, cleared direct Legrand. I'm always thinking, I'd be thinking to myself, yeah, I know. It's a feeder. Can I just get my approach clearance? Yeah, that would be, we could make life simpler. Just give me the clearance now. Same thing happens in New York airspace all the time. And in fact, I once asked the controller about it. I said, can I get the clearance from whatever the name of the fix was? And he's like, no, you can't commence the approach from there. And he was absolutely adamant that you couldn't fly the approach from the feeder. So that explained to me why I never seemed to get approach clearances in New York airspace from a feeder. It's because at least the controller I was speaking with was not aware of the presence of a feeder, either because maybe the display he's using only shows an initial approach fix, or maybe it was a training issue. To this date, I haven't found out why it is that they weren't aware of it. But this begs the question then, as anyone who has flown IFR, have you ever been able to utilize a feeder, or has ATC ever initiated an approach from a feeder for you?
Yep, I've had that several times.
Okay, good. I'm actually thankful to hear that. Okay, cool. So there's our NDB approach. The vector to final is just the same as before. They would give you a vector outside the final approach course, and the intercept would be the same. Yep. One thing I have wondered, and the same thing is true on the VOR approach, if they're vectoring you to final, the final approach course is this. Right, that's what the final approach course looks like. The final approach segment starts at the NDB and goes to there. That 164 track is not part of the final approach course. That's part of the initial approach segment. So my question is, if you get vectored, I've never been or even seen vectors to final before on an approach that has a dog leg. So this is one area I'm actually not positive on myself. Do you happen to know, Peter, if they vector you to final, that's a reference to the final approach course, is it going to be outside, are they going to be assuming a track like this and they'll be vectoring you to join like that, where it's essentially straight in? Or are they going to be vectoring you to join the 164 bearing to the NDB?
They're vectoring you to the straight-in course. That actually caused a problem in Long Beach, of all places. The RNAV runway 30 approach is a slight turn in final, and there are a lot of pilots who are intercepting the intermediate course. It's the final approach course that you should intercept. And the way you can prove that to yourself is if you set up the vectors to final mode on a GPS approach, it'll only show the final approach course. It won't show the intermediate at all, even if there's a turn.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep, that makes total sense. So all of this stuff up here ceases to exist. This all goes away. It's a horrible notation, but now when we're being, so if you're being vectored to final for this NDB approach, there are two ways to be vectored to final. You could be brought in on a, let's see, the final approach course is, call it 190. So you might be brought in on a 160 heading, ironically, because it matches the published course that's there. Or you might be brought in from the east side to it, in which case it would be, what, 220. So you might get a 220 heading. So that's different than what you might assume. It's totally consistent with what we've been talking about before, which is all the action happening outside the final approach fix. That's the final approach fix. We know that because of the Maltese cross down there. And so this all looks very familiar for vectors to final. 30-degree intercepts from either side, life is good. But what is confusing is when you take into account what's going on with full approach up there. You might start thinking, in fact, I was still thinking about it myself, is the vector to final going to be centered around this instead? And Peter made a great point, which is that when you're flying GPS approaches, if you activate the vectors to final mode, the GPS actually erases all this data visually and from the list of waypoints that it will sequence you to. That all goes away, and it just becomes singularly obsessed with the final approach course, and that's it. Which I should have drawn in another color there because it just looks like part of the squiggle. So if you see a dog leg, know that you're going to be, and you're getting vectors to final, know that it's only the final approach course that matters, and that 30-degree intercept is going to be relative to that final approach course, not the pre-dog leg area.
And in one of those weird coincidences, this is exactly the same headings for John Wayne. Final approach course there is 194 degrees also for the ILS. So Keith, what does that little, right where your mouse is, that 339 arrow mean, and what's it for?
I don't know. I need a second on that one. Part of the missed approach procedure.
Got it. Okay.
So I truly didn't know when I was looking at it, and so I just thought I'd just look on the plate to see if there were any other 339 references before I gave up and asked Peter.
Yeah, I was just nervous Peter was going to have to answer it.
So let's look at what the missed approach is, because this does look kind of interesting. See what's going on. So we don't see the field upon reaching the missed approach point, so it's a climbing left turn to 7,000 direct Legrand NDB, then the 339 bearing out of Legrand, and then a right turn back to Legrand. Having trouble. Hang on, let me go read the, this is where the full text becomes handy. Climbing left turn to 7,000 direct Legrand NDB, then the 339 bearing from Legrand, I got that. Then a right turn direct the NDB to hold. Great. What's ambiguous to me on that one is how long do you go on the 339 bearing away from Legrand before you turn back to it and hold? Instinctively, I'd go for a minute, but I don't have a good answer as to why. So I'm going to put my hand up, especially for time reasons, and say, Peter, what the heck is this?
You turn at 7,000 feet. This is I agree, it's very poorly worded. There's a lot of approaches that do this though. So it's saying climbing left turn to 7,000, direct that NDB, Legrand, and the 339 bearing from Legrand, then comma, and that comma is really important. So it's saying you're climbing to 7,000 feet while you're flying all these courses. Then, once you've reached 7,000 feet, then you do a right turn back to the NDB and hold.
Aha. Perfecto. Now I'm just wondering why.
It suits you up the valley a little bit better for terrain clearance.
Is it this 5,500 foot peak over here?
Yeah, that would do it. They have to assume a 200 foot per nautical mile climb gradient from 4360. It's 4 miles to the NDB, so hypothetically you could be at the NDB on the mist at 5,100 feet.
Gotcha. All right. That's a really, really neat mist. I'm glad that we looked at that. Good catch, Mark.
So this is crazy. We're getting bounced around in IMC, and we've got to spot a comma to know what to do. Wow.
Yeah. Just another reason to hate NDB approaches. All right. Calvin had I'm guessing this is a RNAV 14.
Actually, I think he meant a different one. Go down one further, Keith.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So this is the RNAV runway 1 into Waco. See if there's anything different or interesting. Oh, I'm really glad you found this one because this gives me a separate initial approach fix versus intermediate fix, which was what I was really hoping for when I was trying to illustrate that point before about the fact that controllers can give you direct to an intermediate approach fix as long as it's less than a 90-degree intercept that they're giving you to that fix. So we have one feeder. We have Sati. We could be cleared for this approach from Sati. We'd go 3,000 feet to Zaffel. No idea if that's how they pronounce it, but that's like either Xafel or Zaffel, probably Zaffel. And do we have to execute a proceed turn? Any takers? Nope, because there is none published. Okay, so from Sati we go straight to Zaffel, and Zaffel we stay at 3,000, we go to Shale. So here we're on the feeder segment between Sati and Zaffel. Between Zaffel and Shale, we're on an initial approach segment. The initial segment, and then from Shale to Erner, we are on the intermediate segment, so look out below. We only get that 500-foot terrain clearance, or as bad as 500 feet. And let's see if there's anything else interesting. Oh, we have a step down inside the final approach fix, but only, there's an asterisk in the minimums, only if we're shooting the LNAV version of the approach. So this again can be shot as precision or non-precision effectively. And the step down there at Yayuk of 1,200 feet only applies if we're shooting the LNAV version of the approach, So if you were shooting LPV or LNAV VNAV, you'd use the precision guidance that that approach gives you, and you would ignore Yayuk. Then we have a VDP, which is also marked with a star. So that's also only applicable with LNAV. As a reminder, the VDP tells you that when a VDP is present, then you should not leave the MDA until you reach the VDP. So our MDA is 860 feet. That's 350 feet AGL, relatively low. If you were outside the VDP, which is 0.9 nautical miles from the missed approach waypoint, RW01, if you were to spot the field prior to that, you should still not descend below the MDA. Other than that, I don't see anything different, but I'm loving the fact that we have an intermediate approach fix. So a controller could not, if you were over here, they could not say clear direct shale, cleared RNAV runway 1 approach. They couldn't do it because from shale, from that angle, the turn that you'd have to make would be greater than 90 degrees. And that's not going to happen. Yep. I got you, Calvin. Okay. But if we were over here, as long as the angle was less than 90 degrees to shale, we could do it. So even from here would work. We could go to shale. But once we're north of shale, it's really not going to work. Too steep an angle. And this is, as a reminder, this is a fly-by waypoint at shale. Fly-by waypoint means that you don't actually, the plane does not have to go over shale. So if we get to Zafel, if you fly, let's say you're flying this relatively high speed, your GPS is going to use turn prediction, and it's going to give you an indication of when you should lead that turn to minimize your overshoot and keep you as close to the center line of each of these segments as possible. So notice that your plane never, in the way I've drawn this, you never actually pass over shale. So leading the turn would be fine, and in fact, that's what you would, you'd follow the directions given to you by your navigation equipment to make that happen. The same is not true, you'll notice, over the airport itself. The runway 01 waypoint is published as a fly-over waypoint. So let's assume for a moment that this was a, that the missed approach procedure called for a turn out to somewhere. Then you would not lead that turn. So you would have to fly over the missed approach waypoint prior to starting the turn. So that's just a quick reminder about the symbology with flyby versus fly over waypoints. We had discussed that during the stars, during RNAV stars, but I wanted to also show that it's applicable too on these. You'll see it on these RNAV approaches too. Okay.
Keith, can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Finally. I lost audio for a while, so I hope I'm not repeating myself. But what I was interested in is we were looking at the KPWG 17 approach, and these are only separated roughly probably 3 miles on a north-south parallel, I guess, for lack of a better term, or meridian. And I was curious about how tightly one should really be careful of this when they're flying the KPWG 17 that we were looking at, and also considering the KCT1 that we're looking at here. So that was just kind of I don't know, a question just kind of popped up in my mind. What kind of latitude are you really working with? Because it seems like both of them were indicating an initial altitude of 3,000 feet. And it didn't, by the time you get over I'm trying to remember what is the opposite of 1.7. That would be, oh, I don't remember, 3.5, 3.4, something like that. On this one here, if you were coming in on 1, but if you look at the KPWG and you were coming in on the 3.4, 3.5, it seems like it gets kind of sticky in that area. Or am I seeing this closer than it should be?
No, it's a perfectly valid question. And in the New York area, we have something similar. We have Caldwell, Morristown, and Lincoln Park are all within a few miles of each other. And if someone is shooting an approach into one airport, they generally don't shoot any approaches into all the others. So if I shoot an approach into Lincoln Park, which is a non-towered airport, it actually shuts down departures and arrivals at 2 other towered airports that are nearby. So the approach procedures themselves are generated in a vacuum. They're not really cognizant of airspace issues. They're really designed with terrain as opposed to traffic flows in mind. So the existence of approaches at multiple airports doesn't necessarily tell you, oh, I can fly this approach and I'll always be in great shape no matter what. ATC is going to have to do some work potentially to provide separation, and that could mean delaying the approach clearance for you at one airport, even though nobody else is doing anything at that specific airport. So if you're ever curious, let's say you were shooting to depart out of PWG, IFR, and you knew you were the only person on the ground there. You look, you didn't see anybody else there. It's low IFR, and you call for the clearance, called for release, because I've got a guy shooting an approach at ACT or whichever the other airport was. So yes, ATC is going to be on the hook for providing you your separation. I can't tell you the exact numbers, and in fact, the controllers who I spoke to couldn't give me the exact figures either in New York either when I went on when I asked them some questions about that. But yes, ATC is going to have to guarantee separation, and it gets even more complicated at some of the non-towered or basically a non-radar airport, where as you get lower and lower on this approach, you actually disappear off the radar, and now they literally have no way of separating you. So they have to analyze what the missed approach course is going to be, how that affects other approaches, and what the proximity to other approaches is. So yes, you won't see any depiction of that on a single approach plate, but certainly when you're attempting to get this clearance in real life, the presence of other aircraft at nearby airports is going to affect your ability to get this approach.
Okay, thank you.
Okie dokie. Is there an art to pronouncing fixes? I don't know if there is one. XAFLE, I mean, XAFL is just too painful, and I'm thinking of like Xavier is spelt with an X, so I'd call it Zafel before I called it XAFL. But no, I don't think there's really an art to it. I don't think there's a well, there isn't a science to it, so I guess it's an art.
That's the real reason Calvin picked that approach, was to listen to you try to name those fixes.
So I'm sorry, I'm only just catching up on the text. So my reading of this, if there are any questions which are still unanswered, let me know. Otherwise, if we've covered the approach and moved on, I don't want to start trying to answer questions which are 15 minutes old that that everyone's moved on from. But if there's anything I'm missing, let me know.
I really still have the how many times do you think you've flown in and out of Lincoln Park? 1,000? A bunch, anyway. Is there a way that you have been able to avoid what's called the bookkeeper syndrome, where after they look at the same thing and they miss it generally 3 times, they'll never see it again? What do you do in order to keep from becoming, I say familiarity breeds contempt. What do you do to make sure when you look at the Lincoln Park approach that you are so familiar with? What device do you use to make sure that you're absolutely seeing everything and not just assuming that what's on the page is there?
Gotcha. The reality is if there was let's say someone put up a new obstruction on a hill, and so now there's a new obstruction that's somewhere on the plate. And let's say I had previously memorized some of the big obstructions. I happen to not really know of any obstructions on that plate. There's nothing committed to memory, but let's say I had. There's a very, very, very real risk that when I went to go review that plate, attempting to do it with fresh eyes, I would miss that information. So there is some contempt that occurs once you have that level of familiarity with a plate. So the reality is I'm not looking at that approach with fresh eyes when I go to look at it. However, I have an expectation that it is going to be Sparta to Wanva to Jaffe. Those are the things I'm going to look at as I'm approaching from west to east, and it's going to have certain altitudes associated with it. So every time I open up the plate, which again I do every time I do fly it, I've never once flown this blind. Let me pull it up. I'll show you the review that I do. So here's the RNAV approach that I have flown more times than any other specific RNAV approach, although it has been a while. Yeah, long enough that I got one of the fixes wrong. So I forgot about Zarseb. So it's not Sparta. This is exactly what I was talking about with the feeder before. When I once requested the approach from Sparta, they insisted it wasn't flyable from Sparta. But generally I look for Zarseb, Wanva, Jaffe. I make sure that those are still the fixes. And I look for the 27, 22, and then I go double check that the minimums are going to be 1280. Shoot. There it is. There they are, 1280 for the minimums. And that's about it, quite honestly. That's what I'm looking for to change. Those are the significant things that could change, which would really, really mess me up. Let's say they change the MDA down to something that was either higher or lower. I would catch that. Because every single time I look at this plate, I double check, okay, 27, 22, and how low are we going to go? It's 1280. Boom. If they would change anything else, I'd likely miss it.
Okay. Well, I have a very real interest in this because I have a number of family members that are going to be flying out of KPWG, probably that 1-7 approach. And the next 5 years, it's any number of times they're going to be doing it. So I'm just trying to glean a little bit about how I could keep them alive.
Gotcha. The best thing they could do is not just practice that approach. So if they practice that over and over and over and again, let's say they do that approach literally 100 times, and then they start thinking, oh, I'm getting pretty good at shooting approaches. Then the big question is when you put them in front of that fella, how do they do? If you see them making all sorts of mistakes on the LDA 19 right, whereas they're not making that approach on the RNAV 1 into Waco, then it could be that they don't have the ability to brief approaches correctly. It's simply that they have memorized exactly how to fly that one particular approach. So what you want to get good at, which is what I said at the beginning, is how to brief an approach or understand how to look at an approach you haven't seen before and make sure you can fly it safely. That is the thing which is honestly more likely to kill you than having too much familiarity with an approach that ends up changing. I'd say you're much more likely to get killed by an approach you haven't flown before as opposed to one that you have flown before. I haven't thought that through 100%, but that's my initial instinct. And when I see people messing things up, it's for that reason. It's because they've forgotten how to brief approaches in general and because they've memorized their home approaches. So I'd recommend avoiding having anybody fly the same approach 100 times for training to begin with.
Well, I'm not suggesting that that I would do that. It's just the fact that KPWG, like Lincoln Park, is your home airport, and you're going to be flying in and out of it all the time. Wherever you end up going, you normally will end up coming back to this, and given the fact that we often have, especially through the spring, summer, and the fall, we generally end up having some good southerly winds that come up. The chances of being able to do anything else other than a 1-7 are highly unlikely. So familiarity is going to happen whether they want it to or not. But you did answer the question, so I appreciate it.
I got you. Yep, that's a fair point. The only thing I'd probably point out is that as many times as I've flown into Lincoln Park, I've landed at Lincoln Park many hundreds of times, and I know Peter has probably landed at Prescott thousands of times. I have certainly not shot the GPS approach or the RNAV approach into Lincoln Park hundreds of times. I don't think I've actually shot it more in total than probably 11 or 12 times.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because you're mostly doing visuals. And then I'm assuming the same thing will be true down there, that VMC prevails over IMC. So even if you're doing an IFR flight into Waco, unless you specifically request it, you're going to be getting a visual into that airport.
Understood, and I hope they were listening. Thank you.
Welcome. It's a great question, by the way. All right, Reese, and then I'll do mine, and then I think we're good.
I don't actually want to analyze this particular approach. I'm just wondering what the heck it is, because I've never seen anything like this before.
Oh, a high localizer? This is a military-to-military procedure.
Okay. I was wondering if it was military, because there's a reserve base there. So.
Gotcha.
Is the stripe border at the top also an indication?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, the stripe border tells you, and if you want to know what branch of the military, in really small font right to the right of the elevations, you can see USAF.
Yeah. Okay.
Okie dokie. So my approach, if Moon, are you still here? Nope, we lost Moon. So I don't have to do the approach into Kentucky we did then. Amos, you're asking to do the Eugene ILS localizer approach. You know, we haven't actually done a single ILS approach tonight, so it may not be a bad idea to look at one, and that'll be the last one.
So there's a link to that, to the Eugene ILS approach.
Just in time for me to have already gone and got it all.
So that's by what runway, but I just went on 16 left.
Amos, is this the one that you were looking at?
It's still loading. One moment. He said yes, that's it.
Okay. Is there anything specific, any specific question, or did you just want a full review of how to fly it, full approach, and the vectors to final?
Just a full review.
Okie dokie. Okay, there is no procedure turn. You can see over here there is no course reversal that occurs. So we're looking for feeders and initial approach fixes. There's initial approach fix is Corvallis, VOR, the shed intersection. The procedure is not authorized for arrivals at shed if you're coming on Victor 23 northbound. And the procedure is not authorized for arrivals over Corvallis if you're arriving on 081 radial clockwise through the 177 radial. Let's see if we can see why that is. Okay, so let's make sure we don't confuse a radial with a bearing. So the 081 radial is not from over here, heading on the 081 heading to here. So that would be a mistake. So the 081 radial is roughly something like that. So if you're arriving in that quadrant all the way down to the 177, which is about there, if you're arriving anywhere in there, on airway radials between 081 and clockwise 177, so assuming you were heading northwestbound, for example, or westbound or northbound, and your flight over took you over the Corvallis VOR, you're not allowed to execute this procedure because of presumably the turning radius involved under the worst case scenario. My guess is that by the time you make the turn, in some cases there's either a terrain issue, or by the time you intercept, it might be too... Hang on, where's the glide slope intercept at? Zunex. Well, Zunex is 10 miles. Huh. Peter, any idea what they're grumbling about with intercepting it from Corvallis? Is it terrain, or is it something to do with where you might end up intercepting being too far south?
This one's probably just terrain. I mean, the 081 radial is only a, if you're coming in on, actually, that's zero. Let me look at this real quick. Yeah, because it's only a 130-degree turn for Corvallis, which isn't that horrible. And the 177 radial would be a lot less than that, actually, so... Actually, no, it would be more than that. But yeah, this is just terrain. You make that left turn right into that ridge line to the west.
I see, yeah, because that explains it. So I was wondering if it was terrain or if it was how far you'd intercept south of this, but the south part just doesn't make sense. We've got a long way to go to Zunex, so that isn't it. Yeah, there's that 2,700-foot peak right there. This is dropping down to 3,600, and if you overshoot this by a long way, you're going to be getting awfully close to that 2,700-foot ridge. So, yep, definitely looks like terrain. Okay, so that explains some of the regulations there as to why you're not allowed to shoot it, why the approach is not authorized when you're arriving at these VORs on certain airways. Does that mean you're not allowed to shoot the approach at all if you're there? No, just means you can't fly the full approach. There you'd have to get a vector to final. Okay, and let's see, is there anything else interesting here from Shed? Go.
There's one interesting thing here, Keith, and that's Zigta intersection.
Yes, the fact that there's parentheses around it?
Right, which means ATC doesn't know anything about it, right?
Correct. It's a CNF, or computer navigation fix. It's only as a courtesy to people with RNAV capability that they even gave it a name. So if you told the controller, hey, where am I referenced to Zigta? The controller's going to go, in reference to what? Sorry, I think my hand was covering the mic, I just realized. Yes, so the controller's not going to know what Zigta is. That's exactly right. It's just if you happen to have an RNAV, basically an RNAV system that understands that CNF, or computer navigation fix, then it'll help sequence you to that.
So what is the little designation 3600 of FIPMA that's right there on that bold line from Shed?
Gotcha. So it's telling you, it's giving you the information for how to proceed from Shed to FIPMA. So it's saying the MEA is going to be 3,600 feet. And remember, it has to give you a altitude, a course, and a distance. In this case, because there's a dog leg, it's broken up the course and distance into two separate parts. So it's 228 and 5.7 for the first leg, and the second leg is via the localizer, and it's 3.1 DME. It's 3.1 miles from the point at which you'd intercept the localizer to FIPMA.
I see. So it's a 228 heading from Shed to the non-existent Zigta, and then a left turn on the localizer to FIPMA.
Correct, yep. Okay, so that's full approach from Shed. So either way, we end up at FIPMA at 3,600. Go ahead.
So Zicta is RNAV identified, so if you're not going to use that, do you just go direct from SHED to IFMA or IFTA?
No, no. The Zigta is a convenient reference for that point in space. If you have an RNAV GPS, it'll have a name and it'll help you sequence to it. If you just had a Piper Archer with just a VOR receiver and that's it, I'm really glad you asked that, because this comes down to that fundamental question of forget equipment on board. Step one is, where is this plane going to fly? And where this plane is going to fly is this course here. The fact that you don't have the equipment to display Zigta does not mean that your course is going to be this. That's a significant mistake. So either way, you're going to be going over Zigta. Whether you know it's Zigta or not is not really relevant. The ground track doesn't change either way. And this is what tells you that. This tells you that you're going to fly 3,600 feet to FIPMA, and that's on a 228 heading for 5.7 miles, then via the localizer. So it's a 228 heading until you join the localizer, then you join the localizer. There is actually no way of navigating from shared direct FIPMA.
Understood, thanks.
You're welcome. So either way, we end up at FIPMA at 3,600, regardless of whether we came from Corvallis or shared. Then it's down to, well, now it's 2,000, then glide slope intercept. I got that from the from the bird's eye view, then I swapped down to here to confirm as well. So 3,600 feet from FIPMA, 2,000 feet for glide slope intercept, and if we're flying it as a ILS approach, you ignore the halter fix there with the 820, that the star there is going to presumably say that it's for the localizer only. Where is the star reference? Oh, there it is over there. Localizer only. So for a precision approach, there aren't any step downs inside the precision approach fix or the glide slope intercept. So 2,000, it's just a simple straight in ILS down to 569 feet, which is 200 feet AGL. So this is just bread and butter from our ILS approach review from before at John Lane. If you shot it as the localizer, then you do non-precision 3,600, 2,000 at Zunex, 820 at halter, down to the localizer minimums, which are 700 feet. And then the missed approach is straight ahead to 5,200 feet via heading of 163, intercept the Eugene 152 radial outbound to Sagin. Here it is, and there's the hold. Because Sagin is essentially off screen, they have a cutaway for it here, missed approach fix. What is interesting about this is there is an alternate hold published. So those are the published, that's the published missed is out to Sagin. There's actually an alternate missed approach fix, which is Corvallis. So you could potentially be cleared to the Corvallis VOR and hold as published, and that's what they'd be referencing there. But how you get to Corvallis would have to be specified in the missed approach instructions, because the ones that are published, the only detailed missed approach procedure is out to Sagin, down to the south there. Okay. Was there anything else on the ILS that we needed to cover? Awesome. Well, definitely a long one again, but so we'll put this down as being a very long Q&A.
But Keith, we still haven't covered the important point of whether Microsoft Flight Simulator is better than X-Plane.
Yes. Yeah, I only have to wake up in 4.5 hours, so we've still got plenty of time left to talk about X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Sim.
It all depends on what you want to use it for.
Thank you, Calvin.
And the final note, I did a little research regarding that weird approach where the minimums got lower as you got to higher categories. It was a typo, is the simple answer.
You had a pretty good reason brewing before, though, Peter.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I came from, because the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. So yeah, I did the research. It was a typo. All the other approaches it's correct for, but that one it's incorrect. So ignore that entire discussion part. That was just a typo on the approach.
Is that the one where we were talking about how you had, Class C and D aircraft flying inside of slower Class A, B aircraft? And
The minimums were lower on the Class C and D categories than they were for the A and B, which just didn't make a ton of sense.
and that was a typo.
It was a typo on the plate, yes.
Okay, thank you, because I was totally lost on that.
We were all totally lost. I was just the one that was told to come up with the answer to it, so I was trying to come up with an answer that made sense.
Well, if you think about how many plates are actually out there, and we happen to stumble across that one.
And don't worry, Peter, we got your back. We'll edit it out of the video.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's probably best because none of that is accurate.
Or maybe we'll just keep it for when we need a favor.
Careful, too many witnesses.
I was following along with a healthy amount of it, except at the very end, and then I still couldn't get my head around. Okay, why would it be dangerous for an Alpha Category A or B aircraft to descend low? What are they going to hit if they're closer to the airport than the C and D are? But otherwise, it was sounding pretty good up until then.
Yeah, and that's when I realized it. I was like, wait, this makes no sense. So we sort of stopped, and I went back and figured out what the problem there. And yeah, it's just a mistake.
Awesome. And for what it's worth, there are lots of mistakes on various approach plates. I've never seen one that significant, but you'll see plates that don't have, they have a mislabeled initial approach, or just a whole slew of things that are incorrect. You'll see the Jeppesen version versus the NOAA version, and there's extra information on the JEP that's also in the database, if you like. There's a guy who on the AOPA forums who used to work in the TERPS branch and he has access to all sorts of internal documentation about the how each individual approach is designed. There's like a database or a system of record that tracks all the information about the approach that is not the approach plate, and there is often the approach designer called for a certain thing to be included in the approach, which ends up being missing on the plate. And he's posted some of those PDFs in the AOPA forum, and they're fascinating. It explains like where the initial approach fixes are, and what type of fix, and all sorts of altitudes and details about the procedure turn, etc. So this information is distilled down, and they create a plate from it. But because there's human interpretation going on, I guess there's always room for error.
Let me get to the end of the session, but before everybody leaves, in regard to when the tape is going to be cut off.
Okay. Well, I have to go pretty soon, but yes, that was great. We can end there. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll see you all in 2 weeks again. And I'm also curious. This was the first time we did this format, where it was user contributed and user contributed. The format didn't allow for a ton of interaction on each one, so I kind of did it and then moved on. If people have feedback about what they wanted to, did they get the information they were looking for? Again, the idea was not to do necessarily an absolutely detailed review of each plate. It was more to do the same thing over and over with a range of different approach plates, and then see what, did we miss anything important? And a couple of times we did say, oh, that's kind of curious, let's drill down into that. But for the most part, I think we achieved the goal, which was to show that the pattern is just the same over and over and over again. There's just a small number of fundamentals you have to know, and then you can apply that to a plate you've never seen before, and then you'll know what the ground track and vertical profile should be. Now, how you fly it in the airplane, we actually did not get to focus on. But I think we did cover the number one part in to the level of detail I was hoping for. But if anyone has feedback, feel free to let me know. I honestly can't talk too much about it tonight at this point, but if anyone wants to email me, I'd certainly love to know how that how the format worked and if the level of detail was good and if the overall process was useful. So did people walk away knowing more about briefing approaches and how to read an approach plate than they did 4 hours ago, 3 hours ago?